How long do you spend in a podcast about the Civil War on the buildup of the Civil War? We all know the Civil War as, the battles of Gettysburg, Fredericksburg, Antietam, Shiloh, Chickamauga, the Overland Campaign. You all know these things are coming, right? But how long do you spend in the buildup to those events? Gettysburg is obviously July 1863. You have a couple years beforehand where you got to build up to Gettysburg. How long do you spend on that period when the Civil War looks entirely different and has to evolve into what it eventually evolves into when it becomes a very modern conflict by 1864? How long do you spend on the interesting characters that come to the fore when the war is in its infancy, when the war is very weird, for lack of a better term? When you have regular people just tagging along with the army, writing down what they see, when you have, a president in Abraham Lincoln that doesn't really quite know what to do, but he's doing the best he can, when you have interesting, charismatic generals that aren't very good at being generals, when you have all these weird things that come together in this odd stew, how long do you spend on that before you get to the thing that's recognizably the Civil War? That's a question I've wrestled with for the past couple months as I've been putting together this show, because we spend a lot of time on the weird, soupy stuff before the Civil War becomes the Civil War. And if you're expecting, to get into some of those recognizably Civil War things after 7 hours of audio, well, I'm sorry, you're going to have to wait a little bit longer. We get into that in part 3. But this is a study of the weird stuff, a study of those odd political machinations and the policies of the Union and the Confederacy. It's a study in how this thing turns into what it eventually turns into. It's a study of the infancy in the first year of the Civil War and how everybody is, to quote Charles F. Adams, on tenterhooks for an entire year. Everybody's on edge. And that feeling of unease doesn't let up the entirety of the first year. It won't let up for the entirety of the Civil War itself. But after a couple of years, you sort of settled into it. You kind of know what you're signing up for after a couple of years of the Civil War. This first year, nobody knows what's coming. Everybody thinks it's going to be wrapped up within 90 days. Strategy from the top down insists, we'll just wrap this thing up quickly, wash our hands of it and be done, and we'll bring the country back together again. Perhaps a common thread of these first couple shows is that it's so much worse than everybody thinks it is, and yet nobody really knows it yet. I wondered often in recording this just what it would have been like for a regular person to live through this period of, perpetual unease. And there's so many different ways you could tackle that subject, and perhaps I've tackled it in a way that's satisfying to you and intriguing for you to dive into more research. I've got some links to resources in the description below, and I'll also link the bibliography for the show so far down below so that you can dive into a bit more, because if I've learned anything about this is that despite all the stuff that is in this show, there's even more for you to dive into. There's events that aren't in this show that are probably important in the grand scheme of things, but they just didn't fit. So if you want to learn more about this opening year of the war, feel free to go into the bibliography and dive into the source notes and see what else is there for you. But without any further ado, here is The Sound of Distant Guns, Part 2.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Is it rational to voluntarily go to war? That was a question I was considering as I was doing the research for this podcast. Is wanting to go to war a sign that there's a bug in the code, that there's something wrong, that, you need to be taken to the nearest physician? Or is voluntarily going to war something that is it's the peak of human experience? It is, you believe in something so passionately that you're willing to risk potential harm to you or your loved ones in defense of that ideal. I sat back and thought about it for a moment, and I asked myself the question, would it be a rational thing for me to go to a recruiting office near where I live, to go review the posters, and to go sign my name at the bottom of a form that says, yes, I risk life and limb in defense of fill-in-the-blank cause? I'll be honest with you, I didn't have an answer. It feels like there's something inherently wrong with risking your very life and the lives of those around you to go off and potentially get yourself killed. And yet, the inverse is probably also true. There are causes worth fighting and dying for. There's also the line of thinking that says, well, if you don't go sign up, the war's coming for you anyways. It's going to get its hooks in you by hook or by crook. It doesn't really matter whether you want it there or not. Leon Trotsky, the famous revolutionary and communist, said at one point, you may not have an interest in war, but war has an interest in you. So I found myself thinking, when I was putting together this show, was it a rational train of thought for men to go sign up and fight in the Civil War? Was that the ultimate sign that everything was spick and span working underneath the hood? All the code worked just right, the wiring was wired just correctly? Was that the ultimate sign that their humanity was in peak tip-top shape? Or was it a sign that something had gone wrong? That there was a bug in the code and it was eroding? I'd turn the question on you. If war comes to your doorstep, or if it's on the horizon, do you sign up willingly for it? And obviously, I haven't given you the benefit of knowing what you're fighting for, because I think if we were to actually have this conversation for real, we would both agree that there are things worth fighting for. But not knowing the causes aside, and maybe it's impossible to do this exercise where you take away the reasons for fighting, and you just look at the act of signing up willingly to risk life and limb, and maybe it's a thing that you can't divorce it from the causes. The causes justify the action. But is it rational? And I would assume you and I are rational. We would think to ourselves, yeah, I'm not going to go risk my life and those around me for something foolish. And yet, knowing what we know now about the Civil War, a lot of men went and did something that endangered their life. You sign up to go fight in the Civil War, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to die. At least men at the time don't know that, but we know that now looking back on it. We can say, oh, if you're trying to think off the top of your head, what do you think the percentage chance is that a man that signs up to go fight in the Civil War comes home? Like, what are the odds that he's going to be severely injured or killed when he signs up to go fight? If you said 10% chance, it's a little low. What about 25% chance that if you signed up to go fight in the Civil War, you would die? And that's not necessarily just getting into line in battle and being shot or hit with cannon fire or something like that. There's sickness, disease, malnutrition, and then also obviously combat casualties. But there's a 25% chance if you went and signed up to fight in the Civil War, if you volunteered or were conscripted, that you'd be killed. And it leads me to wonder, I guess, as a jumping off point here, why would you sign up? And we finished off the last show about, why did all of these men sign up to go fight in a war that turned into what it turned into? Of course, they didn't know this at the time, but when they signed up, they knew the risks. I was reading a diary the other day of a man named Warren Goss, and he describes the moment when he goes to enlist, to volunteer, and he's talking about how nervous he is when he's, going in to enlist. He's standing outside the door of the enlistment office and he's reading the poster over and over and over again, and he's sweating and he's feeling his heart pulse out of his chest. And then he opens the door and peers inside, and he feels this moment of relief when the officer inside, who's supposed to be manning the recruitment office, isn't there. But Warren Goss manages his emotions, he commands himself, and he waits. And he inevitably does sign up, enlist, when the officer returns. But he knew what it was that he was signing up for. He had seen the effects, I guess, the possibility that you could die. He had witnessed, there's a riot in Baltimore in April 1861. He had seen soldiers killed in the riot, and it reminded him, without even having witnessed one of these big set-piece battles that are to come, he still knew intuitively, oh, I could die. And he signs up anyway. Why is that? I was searching, trying to find just that perfect quote that would encapsulate the why. And it's very difficult. I even grabbed a whole book about the why, or at least it's a book that purports to be a why did men fight kind of a book. And what it does is it gives you sort of symptoms of the cause. It gives you, in their own words, lots of soldiers are saying, it's my honor that compels me to fight. I have a duty as an American. If you're a unionist, I have a duty to defend my government from those who would wish to see it destroyed. Or if you're a Confederate, you feel like there's a personal honor at stake, an honor for your family, for your reputation as a man. But there's also this defending of home and hearth involved there. Or perhaps if you're on the upper levels of society, we're going to fight for our way of life, which includes slavery and all the things that come along with that. But I was searching long and hard trying to find that perfect quote that tells you exactly why men signed up to go fight in a war where there's a 25% chance ultimately that they'll lose their life in the process of it. And I found this quote in a book called Civil War Command and Strategy by the historian Archer Jones. And he says this, quote, "In an era when people took their politics very seriously, reading highly partisan newspapers and finding in political rallies and oratories some of the entertainment which the 20th century has supplied with motion pictures, radio, and television." End quote. Why do I bring out that quote? Why is that the perfect quote for why men fought and died, willingly signed up to go fight and potentially die in a war where it ends up being the case that there's a pretty good chance that they will die? Because this is an altogether different type of individual that we're talking about than you and me. Because, we spend our free time on Twitter or on Instagram or TikTok or YouTube, or the things that we consume, our entertainment, the constant valve of entertainment that we consume is altogether different. And therefore, our worldviews and the things that we value are altogether different. The type of man that would have signed up to fight in the Civil War for all the reasons listed in the previous show and at the beginning of this one, that type of man was directly plugged into the political narrative, had personal stakes in the outcome of the Civil War because he was so personally invested in the outcome. In other words, like Arthur Jones says, this is an individual that is living on a daily diet of political discourse, of oratory. And so when these individuals that are shaping the political narrative, are the political tastemakers, as it were, when these individuals are saying we are at a crisis moment in the United States history, all of these men that are living on a daily diet of this political discourse are taking it to heart. And they are witnessing the potential, catastrophic outcomes that are available to the imagination. So it should come as no surprise to us that when, in the immediate wake of Fort Sumter's shelling and its fall, when Abraham Lincoln sends out a call for 75,000 volunteers, while some states take that to being, a cause to secede, your Virginias, your Arkansas, they say, oh, we can't stand for this. We're leaving the Union. Even still, while Abraham Lincoln calls for 75,000, he gets even more than that. The initial call to arms, I think, is so emblematic of what is strikingly different about how the North and the South go about this acquisition of armies. Abraham Lincoln famously calls for his 75,000 troops. States with secessionist leanings see this as an act of tyranny, as, Abraham Lincoln becoming dictatorial, using his powers far beyond what he is actually allowed to do. And this is where you almost have to remove your knowledge of what the federal government is today and place yourself back in that moment, in that time. Because back then, a lot of the things that we've been talking about that have been, arguments or things that haven't been fully nailed down about what the government is or is not, they are arguments that have to do with federal power, executive power versus state level power. So the Confederacy is going to argue that the states have supreme power over the government and they can sort of dictate and cede power to the government, whereas the North will say that no, the federal government has ultimate power and the states sort of supplement power where the federal government cedes them power. It's two very, very different things. And they seem incredibly, minor on their face, but they're major in practice. And again, you have to remove what you know about how governments work now because, times have changed in the past 160 plus years. And also our understanding of how our federal government works has changed quite a bit in the past 160 plus years. But you get a case study in the difference in governmental styles as, this war breaks out. And it's just a simple microcosm as these two governments set out to acquire armies and they do it in polar opposite ways. So Abraham Lincoln calls for 75,000 troops and it causes uproar where states say, he can't actually do that, can he? And other states, they don't care so much. In fact, there's almost a fervor about it, especially the further north you go, states are more excited about the fact that they get to provide soldiers to serve. They'll consolidate volunteer regiments into these fully fledged regiments and they'll elect their officers and, they'll process down to Washington, D.C., to be cataloged by the federal government. And as they're going through major cities like New York and Philadelphia, they're walking through parades and it's celebrations and huzzah. And, we can't wait to provide our services to the federal government. It's a big celebration. It's a fervor. It's fifes. It's people singing the Star-Spangled Banner wherever they go. It is this, great Americana kind of a moment. So you have these regiments that raise themselves, they bring their own officers, and, it's a big party, whereas the South does things a little bit differently. The federal government calls for an army of 75,000, and then, a month later they call for 200,000 more. The Confederate Congress enacts a regular army, and then they also enact a provisional army, and they are two different things with different purposes. And it's a strategic change that I think is so interesting because it again is a microcosm of this entire experiment of supreme state rights. John Keegan writes about these differences in organizational structure in his book, The Civil War. He writes, and I'll pull two different quotes here. He writes, quote, Confederate efforts to organize were hampered by the weakness of the central government and the persisting primacy of the states, whose governors frequently sought to retain both weapons and soldiers within state borders. The Confederacy never did form a regular army. Its fighting strength was composed of states' forces supervised by its War Department, end quote. He also wrote a little later, quote, On March 6, 1861, the Confederate Congress enacted the creation of a regular army, but its size was set at only 9,000, and little more was ever heard of it. On the same day, the Provisional Army was considerably expanded, Congress authorizing the president to appeal for 100,000 volunteers to serve for 12 months and to accept the service of state militias for up to 6 months. On May 6th, he was empowered without waiting for the approval of the states to take units into Confederate service for 3 years or the duration of the war, if less. In August, still 1861, with 200,000 men under arms, he was authorized to call for another 400,000 volunteers." End quote. If you're like me and you're reading the fine print on the Volunteer Army Agreement, you would realize that Abraham Lincoln retains supreme power over his volunteer armies, while Jefferson Davis doesn't exactly retain supreme power over his volunteer armies. This is going to be a theme that's recurring throughout the entire conflict. The Confederacy is going to struggle with the push and pull of state governors and the Confederate government. The Confederate government almost operates at times like a provisional government, where the states give the provisional government power, but also they reserve the right to say, actually, I don't like that. Let's not do it that way. I'm going to keep my army within my own state's borders and protect my own state. This is something you'll see with Robert E. Lee, where throughout the war, this is not just confined to 1861. This is something that Robert E. Lee feels and deals with throughout the entirety of the war. His Army of Northern Virginia likes to stay in Virginia. So you're going to have a lot of debates later on about, this is armchair historians, armchair generals, multiple decades after the fact are going to say, hey, Robert E. Lee doesn't take the war into its full scope. He's thinking about Virginia. But this is a thing that the Confederacy deals with the entirety of the war, and it starts at the very outset with how they call together an army. They are thinking, how can we preserve each individual state instead of how can we organize a government that will, consider grand strategy, consider all of the different variables going into the war effort, and focus with one hive mind, from top down. Whereas the Union Army, the federal government, they are always thinking top down. Now, you might have differences of opinion from different generals, but there is an organization from Washington, D.C. for the Eastern Theater, for the Western Theater, and then ultimately in 1864, everything is consolidated into one force. Instead of an Eastern force and a Western force, it is the Union Army. But from the outset, you see this strategic difference, which I find so fascinating because it's almost a microcosm of the entire, disagreement between North and South. And the way that it sort of manifests itself, we can look back on it now and say, well, the Confederacy made a mistake because, but at the time, everything is representative of ideology. And this is where you have to put yourself into the shoes of somebody living at the time, because every single thing that is done is representative of the grand issues here. The issues being states' rights or the ability for states to decide their own destiny. And the federal government saying, no, you can't do that, actually. It's such a fascinating little dichotomy there. And also you see a difference in grand strategy. We talked a little bit about Confederate grand strategy, but the federal government's grand strategy is one of conciliation. They are trying to fight a quick war with a quick outcome, and the best way that they decide that they can do that is typified by Winfield Scott's constriction strategy, where he says, we're going to surround the Confederacy on all sides, and we're going to slowly squeeze them over a period of a year or so until they decide that they can no longer fight anymore. And you got to remember, too, the federal government is convinced, Lincoln's cabinet is convinced, Winfield Scott is convinced that there is a pro-unionist minority, a quiet minority in the South that has no interest in a civil war, in a grand civil war, and all the things that come along with that. They believe that if they press the Confederacy enough, this unionist minority will come out of the woodwork and will foster this, reconciliation with the North. Winfield Scott says that we should blockade the South and then create an army of 300,000 men that will constrict the South slowly over, a relatively short period of time. And then after that constriction, and we have, proven to them the inability of themselves to defend themselves, that they will just return to the Union. We'll admonish them, and then we'll carry on our merry way. Archer Jones writes about this in his book, Command and Strategy. He writes, quote, "Whether or not Scott was optimistic," speaking of Winfield Scott, "whether or not Scott was optimistic, he believed that political strategy would have a chance first when compared with his vision of what military strategy would require for a victory. He forecast 300,000 trained Union soldiers fighting for 2 or 3 years, and over a third of the number dead as a result of combat and disease. His projection turned out to be an underestimate, but quite a contrast to Lincoln's call for 75,000 men for 3 months." End quote. Now, expectations of support in the South aside, this call by Lincoln for 75,000 troops and then subsequently 300,000 more troops after that initial call for 75,000 is often attributed as the thing that sent Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, and others on the road to secession. Now, James McPherson, in his book Battle Cry of Freedom, pushes back on that notion that the call for troops was the reason those states seceded. And again, like a lot of things in this conversation, it's complicated. It's very difficult to say this is exactly why this happened, and then this is exactly why this happened. And so you just sort of need to bear in mind, as with many things, in the slavery conversation, as with many things in the constitutionality of actions taken by Lincoln and his cabinet, it's complicated. And you just sort of need to bear that in mind. But here's what James McPherson writes in his book, Battle Cry of Freedom. Quote, "The claim that his call," meaning Lincoln's call, "the claim that his call for troops was the cause of the Upper South's decision to secede is misleading, as the Telegraph chattered reports of the attack on Sumter April 12th and its surrender next day. Huge crowds poured into the streets of Richmond, Raleigh, Nashville, and other Upper South cities to celebrate this victory over the Yankees. These crowds waved Confederate flags and cheered the glorious cause of Southern independence. They demanded that their own states join the cause. Scores of such demonstrations took place from April 12th to 14th, before Lincoln issued his call for troops. Many conditional Unionists were swept along by this powerful tide of Southern nationalism. Others were cowed into silence." End quote. The response by those states, at least in terms of Tennessee and Virginia, those states that were already maybe predisposed to secede at the outset, it didn't matter necessarily what Lincoln was going to do. They might have seceded regardless, and perhaps this call for 75,000 troops is maybe the straw that broke the camel's back. It's hard to know for sure. And again, this is complicated, and it comes down to, who's the governor at the time, what is the tenor and mood within the state at the time. I think if you go back and read a lot of those early sources, you'll find that Lincoln handles different states differently. He's very tender with some states and very hard with other states, and it's all related to what is the tenor and tone coming out of those individual states. The governor of Tennessee replied to Lincoln's call for 75,000 troops, quote, "Tennessee will not furnish a single man for the purpose of coercion, but 50,000 if necessary for the defense of our rights and those of our southern borders." End quote. Governor John Letcher of Virginia replied when he was requested 3 regiments of troops totaling 5,340 men and officers. Quote, "The president had chosen to inaugurate civil war. He would be sent no troops from the Old Dominion." End quote. Now, we're going to have a bit of a constitutional, legal conversation here in a second, but I do just want to pose this question. What are you supposed to do? Let's say you're the president of the United States, and here's how I'm going to set the scene for you. Fort Sumter falls April 14th, 1861. Jefferson Davis has called for 100,000 volunteers March 6th, 1861, and the federal government has yet to call a standing army. And so the Confederacy has established a government. They have a president. They have a 100,000 man, in theory, 100,000 man army in insurrection, in rebellion. And one of your federal held forts has been fired upon by rebels. What do you do? And I don't ask that question as a gotcha question, because I've asked myself that question in the process of doing the research and reading for this podcast. It's like, what would I do if I'm in Abraham Lincoln's shoes? Do I allow, these states that maybe are already predisposed to seceding, do I just allow them to secede anyway and just sort of wash your hands of it and be like, well, so be it? North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, some of these other states, they're going to probably secede anyway, no matter what Lincoln does. And so when he calls troops, is that him, taking the reins of dictatorship and assuming that mantle in an unconstitutional fashion? Or is that just a president that realizes what needs must, and he decides, well, we have a rebellion brewing in the South, they've already got an army, and they've already fired on one of our forts, and taken it, mind you. Federal soldiers have died. What do you do? I say all that as the lead up to the more constitutional question, and I'm going to come at this from probably a different avenue than you would expect, because I'm not going to quote the Federalist Papers, the Constitution, or anything like that. I'm going to quote John Locke. Now, why am I quoting John Locke, and who is John Locke? John Locke is a political theorist and philosopher from England who died in 1704, and he's probably one of the most quoted or followed philosophers by the Founding Fathers as like a collective group when they decide what American government is going to look like. John Locke wrote a treatise called the Second Treatise of Government, he wrote several treatises, but this Second Treatise of Government, for our purposes, is where we're going to go next, because he talks about prerogative in the executive branch of government. What is prerogative? According to John Locke, this is what prerogative is. Quote, "It was the people's permitting their rulers to do several things of their own free choice, where the law was silent, and sometimes too against the direct letter of the law, for the public good, and their acquiescing in it when so done. The executive," Locke contended, "must have the reserve power to act according to discretion for the public good, without the prescription of law, and sometimes even against it." End quote. So what is that in plain terms? In his book, The Imperial Presidency, Arthur Schlesinger translates for us into common language what John Locke means when he's talking about prerogative within the executive branch. This is quoting Schlesinger, quote, "Locke's argument, restated in more democratic terms, was that when the executive perceived what he deemed an emergency, he could initiate extralegal or even illegal action, but that he would be sustained and vindicated in that action only if his perception of the emergency were shared by the legislature and by the people, though prerogative enabled the executive to act on his individual finding of emergency, whether or not his finding was right, and this was a true emergency was to be determined not by the executive, but by the community." End quote. Now, to restate that little caveat I gave you at the very beginning, this kind of thing is complicated. There is no blanket, simple answer for any of this. When the Founding Fathers decided what America was going to be, I guarantee you they didn't consider what the executive should and should not be able to do in the event of a civil war. I assume they all thought that Frankenstein's monster would never rear its ugly head, but here it is, and now a guy from Springfield, Illinois has got to figure out what to do with it. He decides that his answer is, there is indeed an emergency, and I'm going to call an army to deal with it. There is a two-part deal with that John Locke observation, that not only does the executive, or should the executive, have the power to make extraordinary decisions in extraordinary times, but that it needed to be backed up by the legislature or the people. And this is where this situation is so complicated, because Lincoln does get the support of Congress. He calls a special meeting of Congress on July 4th, 1861, and he explains to them, here's why I've done all the things that I've done. He includes his reasons for suspending habeas corpus, and he includes his reasons for calling 75,000 men, and he leaves it up to Congress. He says, here's why I did what I did. Congress, do what you will with that, and Congress backs him up. Now, it is also a Republican-heavy Congress because, obviously, in the act of seceding, these states have recalled their senators that were sitting in Congress. So you have all these Democratic or pro-slavery senators that have now left. So the Congress that Lincoln calls to back up his move, they're all going to side with whatever he decided to do anyway. So again, extraordinary times, interesting situations. John Locke also mentions that the executive will need the say-so of the people. Well, what do you do when the people are rebelling against the government? Do you then have to go ask? And see, here's the thing. You're getting into paradoxes and crazy situations that don't make any sense. Obviously, he's not going to go ask these rebels, hey, should I be allowed to call an army to put you down? You see how this gets foolish? Now, what's so interesting about the theorist John Locke, and it's why I brought him up at all, is because John Locke is famous for his opposition to authoritarianism or to dictatorial tendencies. Now, you also got to think about this from the perspective of who was John Locke at the time and what was the world he was living in. He was living in a post-English Civil Wars world, and you have this conflict between Parliament and a monarch. So John Locke is experiencing this post-Civil War world in England, and he's theorizing what the monarch should and should not be able to do. But largely, broadly, if you're painting with the larger brush and you wanted to decide what John Locke's theories of government were, it's that there's this opposition to authoritarian tendencies, which it's so interesting then that John Locke says in his second treatise of government that an executive, a leader, a monarch must have prerogative in these kind of emergency settings. That is why I ask you, what do you do? Because if I'm in Lincoln's boots, if I'm having to walk a mile in his moccasins, as the saying goes, and I see that there's an army, a rebellious force, and you have these things that have occurred within this short period of time, I'm going to guess that I'm going to call an army. And so it's, again, we said this in the previous show, Lincoln's actions here are all going to be in the eye of the beholder. How do you view Lincoln? That's the prism through which you're going to view this action and several other actions as well. Is he a dictator? Is he an authoritarian tyrant? Or is he a president who's dealt a bad hand of cards and he's doing the best he can in the situation that he's thrust into? A common thread of the soldiers that join up in this early period of the war, this is the Federals, the Yankees that join up to answer Lincoln's 75,000 call, and then also the Confederate troops that join up when Jefferson Davis calls initially for 100,000 troops. These troops all sort of envisage themselves as the Minuteman. They are the reincarnation of the men that arrive when Paul Revere is riding through Massachusetts, calling men to grab the musket off the mantle and to join up in the cause of liberty. In fact, the regimental history of the 6th Massachusetts includes the text of Paul Revere's ride in some of their regimental histories. There's several of them that you can still find, but Colonel Benjamin F. Watson of the 6th Massachusetts includes Paul Revere's ride in his regimental history. And he compares these Minutemen that join up, ostensibly because of Paul Revere's ride to fight the British. He compares the men that gather from like 30 different towns and counties to join to create the 6th Massachusetts Regiment. He says these are Minutemen. Now, it's a little bit different because these men are outfitted with coats and hats and guns. They are not just bringing the flintlock musket from the mantelpiece kind of a thing, but they do sort of represent this neophyte soldier, this guy who doesn't really know drill, but he's all, patriotism and verve and excitement. It's something that I think is overlooked a bit, probably. It's commented on, Helmut von Moltke famously says that this is a war fought by essentially people running around with pitchforks. These are not trained and drilled soldiers, at least not at the beginning. By the end, they will be. But this initial, jump to answer the call, this is just regular guys. These are carpenters and businessmen, and they don't understand drill. In fact, Warren Goss, a private in the Army of the Potomac, will write about how he receives a coat that's too big, a hat that's floppy and it's ungainly, and he's surprised at how heavy his gun is. He has to drill with it for a couple months, and he talks about how it looks so good up on a mantle. It's so nice to look at, but then you have to actually walk around with it and drill with it, and it's heavy. And, he's dealing with amateur officers that don't exactly know how to drill troops because they're, prominent lawmakers or senators. They're not military men. They don't understand drill. They're just reading from a manual as they're telling their men to, march that way, do this, about face. These military maneuvers that these regular men don't understand, but they are just so head up on patriotism that they're so excited to join the cause. I love how Benjamin F. Watson puts it, a colonel in the 6th Massachusetts. He writes this history after the war, and you got to just sort of keep in mind, all these histories are going to try and paint this in the most patriotic way possible. I mean, these are not vindications, but they are kind of these patriotic pamphlets almost that you're going to distribute to, at least in terms of this specific writing, this is going to be distributed to members of the 6th Massachusetts Regiment after the war. It's kind of a remembrance, a look upon what we did in the past with pride kind of a thing. So everything is going to be written in the most patriotic language possible. But this is what Benjamin F. Watson writes about these men that join up and form the 6th Massachusetts. Quote, God only knows what cost these men to sunder family, social, and business ties at a moment's notice for the purpose of engaging in deadly conflict far from home with brothers of the same union and flag, misguided, but brethren still. They were adventurous, but had no ambition to excel in strife. Their schemes of life required for development unremitting attention to the labors and daily duties in which they were involved. These were not mercenaries or conscripts, but independent farmers, mechanics, shoemakers, operatives in mills, merchants and their clerks, lawyers with their students, editors and printers, physicians engaged in ministering to the sick, and clergymen of godly counsels. When they marched beyond the region of their daily avocations, they were sure to leave behind them homes desolated and businesses ruined. And yet, with an alacrity unequaled, they obeyed this night order, prompted by no possible inducement but devotion to the imperiled Union. End quote. The 6th Massachusetts is one among many regiments that are raised initially to defend Washington, D.C. If you look at a map, you would realize that Washington, D.C. is right across the Potomac River from Virginia. Some of you already probably know this, but Washington, D.C. strategically, it's in a terrible position. And the Lincoln administration at first is terrified that there's going to be a Confederate force raised in Virginia that will just cross the Potomac and take Washington, capture the government, sack the White House, capture Lincoln perhaps, and end the thing in one fell swoop. So part of this call for 75,000 is a mad dash to get to Washington to defend the federal government and then figure out what we're going to do next. The 6th Massachusetts goes from Massachusetts to answer the call, and they're going to march down to Washington. They'll process through Philadelphia. They'll process through New York City. In fact, a lawyer from New York City, George Templeton Strong, will write in his diary, quote, "The 6th Massachusetts Regiment, which arrived here last night, was marching down on its way to Washington. Immense crowd, immense cheering. My eyes filled with tears, and I was half choked in sympathy with the contagious excitement. God be praised for the unity of feeling here. It is beyond, very far beyond, anything I hoped for. If it only will last, we are safe." End quote. En route to Washington, D.C., the 6th Massachusetts had to go through Baltimore. They received praise and parades on their way through New York City and then down through Philadelphia, but coming through Baltimore, they're going to get an entirely different sort of reception. You see, Philadelphia and New York, while not being that far away from Baltimore, are altogether different in terms of tenor and tone. They are strictly northern cities, whereas Baltimore in Maryland is not. Baltimore also has this history of rioting. It's this weird kind of thing that you just throw into the mix when you're dealing with Baltimore. Different cities have their own sort of feel to them, right? Well, in 1861, Baltimore has this tenor that is very much willing to riot if things are going bad. They believe, and this is something that you'll read when you're reading documents, primary sources mostly, many Southerners believe in the right to revolution. You're going to have a lot of talking about, what does the war mean? And the time is different. And you can tell that when you're reading some of these diaries by soldiers and lawmakers and things like this. Some of them are going to say, we preserve the right to riot. We preserve the right to rebel if we think that we are doing so in service of a cause that we believe to be just. It goes along with the right to secede, the right to, different states feel they have the right to pull out of the union if the union isn't doing for them what they want the union to do for them. Baltimore feels almost as an extra element that you throw into the mix that they can riot. It's a very tenuous town. Baltimore Mayor George Brown has a tough situation that he's trying to manage, and he's trying to do so and play both sides of this. Baltimore's in an interesting spot where it's very close to Washington, D.C., or Washington City at the time, but it's in a state, Maryland, that has secessionist leanings. So it is a very tenuous spot. So you throw in, okay, Baltimore is tenuous. They might riot. Oh, and also we're going to have U.S. troops coming through Baltimore because on the way to Washington for whatever reason. And I've been trying to figure out why this is the way it is. Like, why didn't anybody fix this prior to now? If you're going to go through Baltimore as a sizable force, you go in on a train, but you have to get off that train and then travel through Baltimore to get to Camden Street Station. I don't know why this is. Like, why can't you just stay on one train and you go on one rail all the way through? But you can't. You have to detrain and go march to your other train. For whatever reason, and I guess it's just the way the railroads are set up, you can't go on one train all the way through. Makes no sense to me. Probably is your chief reason why a lot of this next, messy episode happens at all, because for whatever reason, you can't just sit on a train right outside the city of Baltimore, go past it, and just carry on your merry way. Can't happen. Regardless, the soldiers of the 6th Massachusetts, they ride their first train in, and then they have to detrain and go get on their other train, which will take them to Washington, D.C. As they detrain, they are met by a mob, by a crowd of Baltimoreans. It is a messy situation from the start. And it's interesting, too, because the 6th Massachusetts, they come in different rail cars. So they're not all packed onto one thing, one string of cars right after the other. I think they are separated into 3 different cars. or 3 different trains, and they get separated instantly, pretty much. And what's so interesting is if you'll read some of the primary sources, there's a Colonel B.F. Watson who's writing about how they don't realize that they're separated until they detrain and they look around and they go, hey, wait, where's the rest of the regiment? Well, the rest of the regiment has already detrained and they're working their way through Baltimore, and Colonel Watson's group now has to figure out, okay, well, we have to get to our other train and we'll just figure it out when we get there. Colonel Watson is handling a group of soldiers and a Captain Follansbee is handling a group of soldiers. Instantly, it's bad, though. Civilians are shouting phrases like, Jeff Davis, dig your graves, things like this, at the soldiers. And there's reporting that this mob swells to either 10,000 or 20,000 strong, depending on who you're reading. It gets nasty very, very quickly. Captain Follansbee writes in his report later that, quote, pistols and guns were fired from the windows and doors of stores and houses, end quote. Follansbee detrains, and then they have to walk a couple miles to get to Camden Street Station where they can be taken to Washington. He has 220 soldiers in his group. They are attacked with stones, and members of the mob are coming up to grab their muskets. There's this initial order from Follansbee and Watson from the top down, essentially, that says, don't fire unless you're fired upon. In fact, if there's any reason that you can almost excuse yourself from firing, don't fire. Well, the crowd starts grabbing these muskets. They kill a couple soldiers. They're throwing stones at them from all sides. And so Captain Follansbee orders his troops to fire at will at the gathering mob. Follansbee's soldiers flood onto Pratt Street, and on Pratt Street in Baltimore is where things get really, really nasty. Baltimore Mayor George Brown wrote about it, quote, stones flew thick and fast. Rioters rushed at the soldiers and attempted to snatch their muskets, and at least on 2 occasions succeeded. With one of these muskets, a soldier was killed. Men fell on both sides, end quote. Watson wrote about Pratt Street and how nasty that got, quote, Pratt Street and the cross streets seem to be filled with 20,000 people, more or less, all vying with each other in efforts to injure and destroy the soldiers and keeping up continuous cries and yells. Every place of advantage for their marksmen seemed to be occupied, and from the windows above, furniture and household utensils were hurled into the street by those who had exhausted their ammunition or who had not the command of firearms, end quote. I try to put myself in the shoes of these soldiers that are traveling through Baltimore, and there's thousands of hostile people on all sides of you throwing stones, rocks, utensils. Imagine a fork flying at you, bullets, and you're firing back in return. And this is what's so interesting is every soldier, supposedly, B.F. Watson reports this, every soldier is given 10 rounds of ammunition before getting into Baltimore. Now, I try to think about this, 10 rounds of ammunition, it's not a lot, right? If you're surrounded by 10,000, maybe 20,000 people, 10 rounds of ammunition is not going to do you a whole lot. And furthermore, loading these weapons, it takes about a minute, and you got to pull out your cap to put on. It's a very difficult thing to stand still, because I would imagine loading a gun while running through, a city is very, very difficult to do. So you'd almost have to pause to concentrate to load your percussion cap and to ram your ball home. And, it's a very difficult thing to do, to fire back into a crowd of hostile people that are firing at you. This seems to me like one of the most difficult things a soldier would have to do. Perhaps chalk it up to, put it on the list, firing at an enemy that's firing at you in these lines that eventually become the norm for Civil War warfare. Standing in a line and just firing at the enemy while they fire back at you, that seems incredibly difficult. But firing into a hostile crowd of 10,000 while you're trying to put home your percussion cap, while you're trying to ram your ball home and rip the wadding and the things that are required of you to fire back into the crowd. It seems incredibly difficult, and it seems like something that would require a steel nerve. And I can only imagine that these soldiers are just pissing themselves. Furthermore, you have soldiers as part of the 6th Massachusetts that are 16, 17 years old. These are just boys. One of them, a boy named Luther Ladd, will be killed. Luther Ladd is killed supposedly, and it's tough to know exactly. He's supposedly killed because he's shot in the leg and smacked in the head with a hunk of iron. Lieutenant Jepson of the 6th probably is writing about Luther Ladd when he says this, quote, "The first man I saw killed in the war was about 10 minutes after starting. He'd been struck by a rock. He lay in the middle of the road and was trampled upon by the crowd. I thought then that it was one of the most horrible sights I ever saw, and I'm not sure now that it wasn't." End quote. Supposedly Ladd says as he's dying, "All hail, stars and stripes." I'm sure he probably didn't say this, but that's what's reported afterwards. I would imagine his actual, the thing that he said was probably just a grunt or something. Imagine you're hit in the side of the head with a rock and you're shot in the leg and you're dying and you're being trampled, and you look up to heaven and just so perfectly say, "All hail to the stars and stripes," before falling dead. As a 17-year-old, no less. Seems to me incredibly difficult to believe, but, what do I know? Luther Ladd is not the only soldier who will die. He's one of 4 soldiers that will die. And what gets so interesting about this situation is you'll have varying reporting about how many civilians die. Mayor George Brown is sort of stuck in the middle, like we said, trying to, preserve law and order as best he can, but clearly law and order cannot be preserved in a situation like this. He will say that a handful of civilians die. Shelby Foote, the writer of the magnum opus about the Civil War, he has it that 12 civilians died. And the regimental history of the 6th Massachusetts says that 9 civilians died. And what's so interesting is Colonel Watson, when he's writing about it afterward, he will quote a Chaplain Jones, who says this, quote, "Loyal men of Baltimore who were careful to collect all of the facts are of the opinion that about 100 of the mob were killed by the guns of our soldiers." End quote. So here's what's interesting, right? We have a great disparity. Did 12 civilians die? Did 9 civilians die? Watson writes that, or he points out, I guess, that each of the 300 soldiers of the 6th Massachusetts are given roughly 10 rounds of ammunition, and he says that they probably fired 1,500 rounds of ammunition into the crowd. And so it does make you wonder, right? If only 12 civilians died and the regiment fired 1,500 rounds of ammunition, that seems difficult to believe, right? I would imagine that probably more than 12 would die if you fired 1,500 rounds of ammunition. But at the same time, it's so scantily reported that there's any more than like a handful of civilians that are killed. You go through the newspapers, and a lot of these newspapers are just parroting what other papers are saying. So they might have one source of truth, and they're all just copying it and reporting it to their readership. But you're going to find that it's a handful, 10, 15, not 100. And what's so fascinating about that Chaplain Jones quote is I have no idea who Chaplain Jones is. B.F. Watson seems to think highly enough of him to quote him in his recollections of the event, an event that he was witness to. And so you have to wonder, did B.F. Watson think that probably more than 12 died? And therefore he's just trying to find a quote that would corroborate that. He's like, there's no way that just 12 of them died. I was there. Certainly there was more. And so he goes and finds a quote of this Chaplain Jones who says that certainly 100 of them did. And he gives you the reassurance that loyal men of Baltimore who were careful to collect all the facts, right? It's very difficult to know. after doing the research for it, and you have 12 here, 9 there, 100 there. It sort of boggles the mind. There's no way of knowing how many civilians die in these Pratt Street or Baltimore riots. The police eventually show up and they escort these 6 Massachusetts, or at least they escort Captain Follansbee's group of the 6 Massachusetts. B.F. Watson's group have fought their way through. He talks about how they capture like a carriage driver, and he, forces them to, he commandeers the carriage, forces him to help his soldiers get through. There's one point too, I guess, circling back, B.F. Watson is writing about this, and they're on the train, his group, which has been separated from Captain Follansbee's group. And again, they have this order not to fire, right? And what's so interesting about these regimental histories, or about these very patriotic sources, is that they always have kind of this flair of patriotism in the writing. I mean, it's very clear what the goal is. The goal is to, at least with this one, you're trying to, bring back memories of the glories of your regiment from in the Civil War. This is written after the war's over. So you almost take some of the reporting with a grain of salt, because, did it actually happen this way? Who knows? And you go back to that Luther Ladd quote where he says, "All hail to the Stars and Stripes." Did he actually say that? Probably not, but the regimental history is trying to, lionize the kid who's killed, and so they give him a great quote after he's gone. Well, B.F. Watson writes, in this regimental history after the fact, he says that they're on the train, and he's got this order, don't fire. Well, one of the soldiers on the train, they're standing there, they're just sort of waiting for the shoe to drop, I guess. One of the soldiers holds up his thumb that's been shot off, and as B.F. Watson says it, he's smiling, he's triumphant, and he says, "Hey, look." So then Watson goes, "Okay, yep, you can fire now." I mean, just imagine that, right? You've got your thumb shot off, and you're excited about it because now, okay, we have an excuse, we can fire on the crowd. You see how this thing gets... Sources like this are so much fun to read because you get a lot of color in the situation, but can you even trust it sometimes? I would imagine if my thumb was shot off and was just, gushing blood there on the train, I'd probably fall over. I mean, that's just me. Who knows? Regardless, after forcing their way through the mob, the 6 Massachusetts is escorted by policemen of Baltimore. They get on a train at Camden Street Station, and they go to Washington City, where they are incorporated into the new forces that are gathering around Washington. The federal government is looking for martyrs at this point. They're looking for anything they can grab onto to get more volunteers. And the soldiers killed in Baltimore are put on ice and escorted back home. They will then lie in state in their respective town halls. It's so interesting because you read Warren Goss, we've quoted him already, his personal diary of the event says that, quote, "I had read the papers and attended flag raisings and heard orators declaim of undying devotion to the Union. But when it came down to it, it was the news that the 6th Massachusetts Regiment had been mobbed by roughs on their passage through Baltimore, which gave me the war fever," end quote. Meaning he's hearing all of the patriotism being spouted from every pulpit. Everybody is all head up on patriotism in the North, right? But you don't have the fire that touches the kindling that sets everything off. It's the 6th Massachusetts going through Baltimore that is that spark, at least for Warren Goss. He goes down and volunteers the next day. Broadly speaking, this Baltimore riots, it speeds things along, as it were, but things were already speeding towards conflict. I mean, war was a foregone conclusion once you've called your armies. It was just a matter of how it was going to be conducted. What's so interesting for me, and maybe this is the nerd in me coming out, it's the strategy from the get-go, because the South instantly thinks of this as a total war. I mean, it is a war of preservation. It is You're going to invade and we're going to defend home and hearth kind of a thing. I mean, the stakes are everything for the South from the very beginning. For the North, it's more complicated. As John Keegan writes, quote, "The South formed half the national territory, an enormous area that touched the North's organized regions at only a few widely separated points. There was contact between the South and the North's region of great cities on the Atlantic coast corridor of Maryland and Pennsylvania, a region amply supplied with railroads. There were some tenuous connections between the North and South in the Mississippi Valley, where there were riverine links, but a dearth of cities and population. As a result, when the war broke out in April 1861, it began in a haphazard, unplanned, and largely undirected form, the embryo armies falling upon each other as and when found." End quote. What he's really getting at there is that strategically, grand strategy, right? This kind of a war is very difficult to nail down exactly what you're going to do. You have the conflict at the top in the Lincoln administration. General Winfield Scott has his Anaconda plan, where we're going to squeeze the South slowly over a period of years. You have different generals like, Ulysses S. Grant. Further, a couple months into the war, he says that, hey, we should go find the enemy and defeat him, his force where he is. We should go capture points. These are very different strategies to the Anaconda plan, which says that, after we have squeezed and prevented the South from resupplying, that they'll just sort of give up. It's very, very similar to, if you've studied strategy, it's very similar to what the U.S. uses in the Vietnam War. It is a smothering tactic. And what's so interesting, too, is the United States never actually declares war on the Confederacy. And you might think to yourself, wait a minute, how is that possible? We're at war, right? Well, Keegan puts it this way, quote, "It was legality which prevented it from doing so," meaning the federal government. "In Northern eyes, the South was not independent, but remained constitutionally a part of the Union. The Union could not fight itself or even part of itself." End quote. It's this division, I guess, on strategy and also the technicalities that you have to adhere to, right? I mean, you're fighting yourself. You're trying to reintegrate yourself into a homogenous country again. And this is like you're towing fine lines here. And also, the Lincoln administration, like we said, is plagued by this idea that there is this unionist, silent, maybe not majority, but certainly they believe that there's a significant amount of unionist sympathy in the South, if only they can just kind of pull it out, kind of a thing. The South, in its inverse, it's much more of a simple strategic thing. The problem is, as John Keegan will point out, and again, bear with me a little bit. John Keegan is so good on the strategic part of this that I just keep pulling out quotes. But, he's obviously not the only historian writing about this. There's quite a few others. But, bear with me here. The South has a strategic problem, but also a strategic simplicity that is so different from the North. And Keegan points it out in his book, The American Civil War. Quote, "Jefferson Davis's problems in running the war were the obverse of Lincoln's. He had several outstanding battlefield commanders who showed their quality from the start, notably Thomas Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, and, in the leadership of cavalry, Jeb Stuart and Nathan Bedford Forrest. What the South lacked, both at the outset and throughout the war, was a strategic mastermind. The lack may have been due to the inherent weakness of the South's strategic position, cut off from the outside world and unable to match the North in mobilizable manpower. Still, it might have prolonged the war even longer had it adopted and persisted in the strategy Joseph E. Johnston advocated and practiced in 1864, avoiding battle, conducting an offensive-defensive campaign, and exchanging space in preference to fighting." End quote. If you think about the Southern theater, the theater where the Civil War will be fought broadly, it is an enormous amount of space. I mean, it's thousands of miles. And two, there's not railroads, freely populating the South and the West the way they are in the North. There are some railroads, but it's not such a densely populated, rail lines that it's easy to move around. There's adequate, but you're going to have to do a lot of marching. You're going to have to do a lot of going to find the enemy, bring him to battle and defeat him kind of a thing. And because there's so much space, the South has the ability to, bug your enemy to attack his supply lines or his pickets and then withdraw and sort of force him to chase you around the country. And theoretically, from a grand strategy position, if you're able to kind of harry your enemy and make him chase you all over the place and never really bring you to a decisive battle, theoretically, you can preserve your forces. Again, theoretically, preserve your forces for a very long period of time, especially when you're outmatched in terms of, production and things like this. But that's not to say the South can't produce. I mean, the South is, I think I was reading that if you were to look at the economies of the North and the South separated from one another, and you stack them up against the rest of the world, the North was number one. I mean, it was a great war economy. And the South, while it's not as potent as the North, it's still top 10. I mean, it's still a potent economy in its own right. If they can just figure out the strategy part of this, they'll be just fine. Now, Keegan does point this out. He says that, quote, Lee, talking about Robert E. Lee, was not really a strategist, though he was a brilliant tactician and operational leader. His campaign of limited offensives into the North in 1862 and 63 is still a model of how a weaker power may bring pressure to bear on a stronger, and it may be argued that Lee's failure was in lack, end quote. Anyways, all of that bird's eye view aside, as soldiers are streaming into Washington City and thousands upon thousands are populating, the question becomes, what are we going to do next? I think the South and Jefferson Davis have a pretty clear-eyed view of what they're going to do next. He makes Beauregard the hero of Fort Sumter, the general of forces in the theater, and he also has forces at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Beauregard becomes holed up in Manassas Junction, which is this junction where several railroads come together. Beauregard, as he's planning for what will happen next, he's starting to think of a Napoleonic kind of a strategy, a flanking strategy, a bold hammer and anvil kind of a strategy where he can crush whatever Northern forces will come against him. But he's very cautious. And two, you have such green soldiers that a lot of the maneuver and the actual battlefield, the way the actual battles will go, at this early juncture, it's so difficult to know. I mean, these generals don't really know what they've got in terms of soldiery, in terms of infantry. But it becomes pretty obvious pretty quickly that whatever is going to happen is going to have to be instigated by Northern forces, because the South, these forces led by Beauregard, they kind of coalesce into this Manassas Junction. They take the junction and they start to resupply. They start to figure out, okay, what are we going to do? Do we have order? And they're starting to do the basics of supply and organization and kind of get all their ducks in a row. While Confederate forces set up their positions in Manassas, U.S. forces in Washington are trying to figure out exactly how they're going to engage Confederate forces near Manassas. It's a foregone conclusion that an engagement will happen, but it's a matter of how. And at this moment in time, General Winfield Scott is calling the shots in Washington. He is the most decorated general in U.S. history. He's practically a superhero, at least militarily. He's a veteran of the War of 1812. He's a veteran of the Mexican War of the 1840s. And he is, by all accounts, the preeminent military mind in Washington when this war kicks off. The problem is, Winfield Scott can't sit on his horse. He's an invalid. He can only work for a couple hours at a time before he, inevitably falls asleep. He's completely unable to do the, rigorous tasks required to actually plan an offensive, but he is the preeminent mind, and so therefore he gets this deference from the presidency and the administration, who, by the way, still don't understand how military tactics work. I mean, we are really trying to, throw this thing together, and it is an absolutely amateurish job from the get-go. You have all these people that are trying to conduct a war, and they don't really know how to conduct a war. So Winfield Scott becomes your natural choice to decide how the war will be conducted, because in a room full of people who don't understand warfare, Winfield Scott happens to be the one guy who does. What's so interesting is his choice of general for this next offensive. He chooses Irvin McDowell to lead the army. And it's interesting because he will ask McDowell what McDowell wants to do. He asks him for his battle plan, essentially. McDowell will spend a day or two putting together a plan. He gives it to Scott, and Scott just sort of sits with it. McDowell's an interesting guy. Winfield Scott is, we talked about him a little bit. Winfield Scott is a very interesting guy in his own right. I mean, you talk about a superstar, a Hollywood star. That's essentially what Winfield Scott is. He's somebody who almost thirsts for respect, and he gets it from just about everybody at this point in the story. And Irvin McDowell is this very dour sort of a fellow. He's a very interesting guy. Bright, by all accounts, extremely bright. And some of these primary accounts that we're going to quote here about the battle will go out of their way to point out that McDowell's plan for the Bull Run campaign is really good, and then it just doesn't work because the soldiers can't execute it. But McDowell, very interesting fellow. David Detzer writes about him in his book, Donnybrook. He gives this really long description of Irvin McDowell, and I'll quote parts of it here because I just find it so interesting to get like the full picture of what this guy is. David Detzer writes in his book, Donnybrook, quote, McDowell, 43, was a many-layered person. Physically, he was rather unattractive. He looked ungainly, almost a cartoon of a huge Prussian artillery shell, with his short, stumpy legs, a great barrel body topped by a thick neck and a bullet-shaped head, his receding, close-clipped hair combed flat against his scalp. His cheeks were naturally florid, and jutting below his chin was a stub of a beard flecked with gray. In manner, he intended to be modest, open-minded, and frank, but he lacked any sparkle of charisma. In conversation, he was never gruff or openly rude, but he had no gift for conviviality. Though quite bright and well-read and occasionally capable of fluent conversation, he tended to be reserved. Detzer describes him as highly skilled in the preparation of dishes such as a Delmonico chef, which apparently, Detzer points out, may have made him acceptable to Winfield Scott, another noted gourmet or foodie, who was so entranced with the topic of food he could devote 10 minutes to a lecture on why the practice of letting one's fork touch lettuce was culinary gauche. End quote. McDowell was a West Point man. He'd graduated in 1838. He was one of a few of those seasoned officers who had fought in the Mexican-American War, who had commanded troops, and was also a well-respected tactician at the same time. The problem for Irvin McDowell is, and was, that the forces he was going to need to execute his orders were not quite up to snuff yet. David Detzer illustrates this, quote, McDowell also had hardly any aides to carry orders to the regiments. The problem, however, was not how many aides he had, but how knowledgeable they were about military matters. He later told the Joint Committee, suppose he sent an aide to General Tyler, one of his divisional leaders, with orders to do something, and Tyler was uncertain what the message meant. Now quoting Tyler, does he want me to do this, Tyler might say, or do that? A proper aide would understand the nuances of the original order and be able to refine it on the spot, according to local conditions. McDowell's most critical deficiency was that he had no chief of staff or even a second in command. He had to do far too much himself. One observer, after visiting him, noted, now quoting the observer, quote, I saw him do things of detail which in any even halfway organized army belong to the specialty of a chief of staff. End quote. Detzer continues, when asked why that was, McDowell informed him, quote, now quoting McDowell, that General Scott allowed him not to form a complete staff. End quote. It seems the ultimate prerogative for attack came from the top down, from Abraham Lincoln. Forces had been milling around Washington City for several weeks, and while Winfield Scott had chosen a general, they hadn't actually decided what they were going to do. Supposedly, Winfield Scott felt that they couldn't do a full-out assault because they didn't have enough wagons to actually supply any of the forces that would be sent. And these forces, by and large, it was agreed, they weren't well trained enough to actually execute whatever orders they would be given, so they stayed still. But Confederate forces were not very far away. In fact, you could just reach out and touch them. And while everybody knew that patience was required, everybody also knew that initiative was also required. It was this weird dichotomy where you knew that you had to figure some things out and get things rolling, but you also knew that you had to go do something. You had to create momentum. Ultimately, Abraham Lincoln supposedly gives the order to Winfield Scott to do the attack, and James McPherson writes in Battle Cry of Freedom that it was Lincoln's choice to attack. He writes, quote, "In response to a directive from Lincoln, McDowell drew up a plan for a flank attack on the 20,000 Confederates defending Manassas Junction. An essential part of the plan required that 15,000 Federals near Harper's Ferry under the command of Robert Patterson, a 69-year-old veteran of the War of 1812, to prevent the 11,000 Confederates confronting him from reinforcing Manassas." End quote. Problem was, Patterson didn't actually do that. He encountered Joseph E. Johnston's Confederate troops in and around Harper's Ferry, but he didn't actually contain him. Patterson was worried that his troops, who were on short contracts, would just up and leave, so he was afraid that if he were to sort of stay and maintain his position, that he would be defeated if he drew Johnston into an actual battle. And so the net result is Joseph Johnston's 8,000 men are able to join Beauregard's men at the Manassas Junction. The effect of this is that while McDowell is making his plans, he doesn't actually know that Patterson has failed to contain Johnston's men. And so he orders the advance under pressure from Congress and Abraham Lincoln, and his forces advance towards Manassas, but he doesn't actually find out, McDowell, he doesn't actually find out that Johnston has been able to reinforce Beauregard until after the battle. It's probably one of those moments where the battle occurs and then McDowell goes, why did that go the way it did? And I'm sure there's a litany of reasons as to why it does go the way it did, but a lot of times people, when they're doing the armchair generaling afterwards, they're looking at Patterson and saying, why didn't you do your job? You had one job. Anyways, if Herman von Moltke was ever correct about the Civil War, it would have been about this battle. Von Moltke supposedly says, of course, that the Civil War is just, two mobs chasing each other up and down the countryside, that there's no order, that there's no, classic organized infantry the way that the Europeans would have done it, right? Well, if von Moltke was ever correct, he would have been correct about Bull Run, because this is two mobs, essentially. These are not drilled men. These are not men that have gotten the experience of fighting Civil War battles, because this is really the first one. It can be found in a lot of different ways. I mean, we quoted that the aides didn't even fully understand what military orders were. You have such a small section of officers who actually understand how this warfare works. The infantry doesn't fully know yet. Obviously, the general staffs, they don't fully know how to actually go about doing, military stuff. They don't quite know what to do yet because they haven't had time to learn. It can be no clearer than in just something as simple as uniforms. James McPherson writes about the South's uniforms, quote, "Although the South selected cadet gray as its official uniform color, each regiment initially supplied its own uniforms, so that Confederate armies were garbed in a confusing variety of clothing that defied the concept of uniform. Cavalrymen and artillery batteries provided their own horses. Some volunteers brought their own weapons, ranging from bowie knives and Colt revolvers to shotguns and hunting rifles." End quote. There's a lot of things I could say that would just describe this battle in such an amazing way. And I was trying to think, I was sitting back thinking, like, how do you describe a battle like this and what it means? Because the Battle of First Bull Run, the reason why I'm taking so much time with it is because it is incredibly emblematic of, what life was like before the Civil War and how the Civil War just changes everything on almost a dime's turn. I mean, it happens so fast. And you wonder, how were the people involved in this thing? How did they feel these emotions of things changing so quickly? I mean, It's so obvious that these men don't know how to fight battles, and yet they're thrust into a battle, and they're witnessing Civil War era combat, and they've never seen anything like this before, and they don't know how to react to it. I was trying to think, how do you describe this battle? And ultimately I decided, let's just quote men who fought in the battle. I could narrate and tell you, this division moved here, and Colonel, such and such did this, and General such and such did that. But I feel like we would almost lose the forest for the trees if I just described troop movements to you and did the punch counterpunch sort of a description. But I found a primary account by a guy named Edwin Barrett, who accompanied a Massachusetts regiment. He's not a soldier, he's a regular guy. He's not even quite a journalist, but he acts like one throughout this battle. And in a lot of ways, I think this account describes the nature of early Civil War battles. You don't have the military regimentedness yet. Journalists, even pseudo-journalists, and let's be honest, he's just a guy. He's just a guy from Massachusetts who's accompanying a troop from Massachusetts, and he's accompanying the troop for, it's not even a reasons unknown. He's accompanying because he wants to see what's going to happen in the battle, but he's not actually participating in the battle. He's just watching, and he writes it down, and then 25 years later at a reunion, he delivers this address where he says, here's what I saw. It's a great primary source because you get a feel for everything. You get a feel for the non-professionalness of this battle. Is that a word? Non-professionalness? The lack of professionalness? But he delivers this address, 2 decades plus later, and you wonder how much of this was dressed up for effect. But even still, if it's dressed up for effect, some of the things that he'll talk about here don't make him look super great. Like he's going to climb a tree at some point. He's going to be eating fruit and watching the battle. And if you were really dressing it up, would you include that part where, you didn't do anything to help the cause per se? You're just eating fruit, climbing a tree? I would imagine if you are dressing this thing up to make yourself look the best possible, you wouldn't include that part. You would just say, I was riding a horse, observing everything, but, maybe that adds something to it to have all of that there. So, there's so many different ways you could go with this. I could quote this or that, but this Edwin Barrett section to me is so fascinating. It gives you the clearest picture of what this is all about. And I'm about to break probably one of the cardinal rules about writing history, about narrating history, is that you're supposed to do all this in your own words and you're supposed to quote things sparingly, but this section to me describes so much, so far better than I could ever describe any of this. So what's the point of me trying to do it? Let's just quote Edwin Barrett. So bear with me. We're about to do a big section of quoting here from this primary source, Edwin Barrett. Without any further ado, here's Edwin Barrett's account of the First Battle of Bull Run. He begins, quote, "It proved to be at Blackburn's Ford, 4 miles south of Centreville, and the object of our attack was to ascertain the strength of the rebel right wing. It was 10 o'clock at night before we reached our camp at Centreville, tired and jaded with our long march. Our rations were exhausted, and a light drizzling rain was falling. Our camp was located on the top of a high hill, and from this elevation we could look down upon the campfires of 30,000 men, a magnificent spectacle, and one long to be remembered. The ground itself was an old cornfield, and I remembered that it was with some difficulty Captain Prescott and myself could find a level place large enough to accommodate us, as we both slept under the same blanket. On Friday, we rested in camp waiting for our supplies to feed the army. In the afternoon, cattle were driven into the camp and slaughtered, and the meat passed around before it was cold. Consequently, the beefsteak was very tough, and I much preferred the hardtack." End quote. Edwin Barrett continues his account the next morning. Quote, "There was not much sleep that night. The hum of preparation and expectancy seemed to pervade the vast camp, and the thought of what the morrow might bring must have forced itself upon the minds of all. The night was cool, and at 12 o'clock I awoke, feeling very cold, and unable to sleep more. I anxiously waited for the signal to prepare. At 2 o'clock, one drum sounded through the camp and was repeated through the numerous camps around us. And in 1/2 an hour, 30,000 men stood ready to battle for the Union. The army moved in 3 divisions. General Richardson to attack the rebel left wing with artillery as a feint, General Tyler in the center, and General Hunter, by a long circuitous route, was to attack the rebel left and try to outflank him, bringing his line so as to cooperate with General Tyler. End quote. Barrett is in the center division, and they move down into this valley and go through a forest for about a mile. And once they come out of the forest, it opens up, and then they can see the field of battle. They see the cannons exploding and, the musketry going off. And what's so interesting about this moment is Barrett takes this opportunity to observe the command structure, to observe McDowell and his staff officers. And he decides he's going to climb a tree and sort of observe the battle from a bird's eye view. But you also get the added point of view that Barrett will add to it, which is really interesting. So he climbs a tree and then says this, quote, "Opposed to Burnside and directly under my eye was posted the rebel brigade under General B, with 2 Georgia regiments and a 4th Alabama, partially protected by an angle of fine woods, being part of Joe Johnston's army just arrived from Winchester. On the left of General B and facing our right, Stonewall Jackson was in command, while some 4 or 5 miles away on the rebel right, near Blackburn's Ford, General Beauregard was posted with a large part of his force expecting our main attack there, he being deceived by the artillery fire of General Richardson's division, which was intended as a feint and to hold Beauregard to this point, while McDowell outflanked him. McDowell's plan of battle was unquestionably a good one, and he should not be held responsible for the delays which caused its failure. It was now between 11 and 12 o'clock. Our division had been rapidly placed in position and all the time exposed to the fire of the rebels. Ricketts' battery took a position to the right of my tree just across the road, and in the rear of our infantry lines and to the right of Ricketts was the battery of Griffin. The Rhode Island battery was on my left, some 50 rods from Ricketts, and in the rear of Burnside's brigade. Ricketts' battery now opened fire with shell, and the first shot struck fairly within the rebel lines, and our men cheered at their success in getting the range so quickly. Then opened the Rhode Island battery with equal vigor and precision. The firing spread along our whole line to the right, the left having been steadily engaged. Promptly did the enemy respond. It was an incessant roar of artillery and rattle of musketry, grand beyond my powers of description. Our infantry in the valley commenced their rapid firing. Advancing to fire, some regiments sheltered themselves by lying flat on their faces, while the rebel shot passed over their heads. Steadily but slowly we marched back the enemy. More than 10,000 infantry and 20 pieces of artillery were sending their shot and shell into the rebel lines, while the enemy responded with equal vigor." End quote. The reason why I pick Edwin Barrett's account here is because you get maybe a microcosm of this entire Bull Run battle in one account. You have a civilian journalist, pseudo-journalist. Is it even proper to call him a journalist? He's a observer. He's a guy. He just tags along with the army. And because he tags along with the army and just sort of hangs out with the troops, which in and of itself, it tells you so much about the nature of this offensive, that you have a civilian tagging along with the army, sleeping in a tent. He's observing the Colonel Prescott of the regiment he's tagged along with. He's observing McDowell, climbs up in a tree, eats persimmons, and watches the battle play out below him. That says a lot about the battle, doesn't it? And it's just such an interesting sort of a thing because journalists have observed battles for millennia, right? They might not always be called journalists. They might be just the individual who observes the battle and then goes back home to deliver an account of it. But men have been observing battles for a long time, and journalists have accompanied troops into military maneuvers for a long time. But not often do you get a civilian right in the press of the battle and almost inserting himself in a manner that somebody could have just handed him a rifle and he would have just gone in the line and joined the men. But he doesn't. He's up in a tree. To my mind, this account of Barrett's highlights the nature of the Civil War in a single account. It tells you almost everything you need to know without telling you everything you need to know. It's not explicit, but if you're looking for examples of, hey, this war is different from other wars, here's a really good example. You have a regular guy accompanying troops, marching along with the columns, observing everything, writing it down. He's not exactly working for a newspaper. Again, it's just such an odd kind of a thing. And Barrett delivers this account years afterward. This is pulled from the 25th anniversary of the battle, a reunion of a Massachusetts regiment. And Barrett, the guy who just accompanies the regiment throughout the battle, he, of course, delivers a speech at this 25th anniversary. And you wonder how much of this is embellished for the anniversary to sort of, make it sound better. He's had, the benefit of 25 years of context to know exactly how to present this sort of a thing. It's just such an interesting account, and I've found myself so fascinated by it for so many different reasons that it kind of acts as a microcosm for this battle for my mind. And it's not even a military account, but this battle is such a frenetic sort of a thing. It's, as Moltke says, it's just mobs going at each other and they're just trying to figure it out. And it's almost, whoever lasts longest wins. Don't be the first one to break and you'll win. Don't screw it up and you'll win. And Edwin Barrett sort of embodies all of this in one non-professional random guy's account of the First Battle of Bull Run. Anyways, after a couple hours of observing the battle from up in his tree, Barrett descends from the tree and gets to witness the disorderly chaos that follows the Battle of Bull Run. He sees the units breaking up and men streaming all over the place, and he interviews some people, witnesses, some wounded, some dead, and he writes about it, quote, "Leaving the tree, I started for some water at the little house on my left, where I could see quite a crowd of soldiers clustered around the well. I stopped to speak with a rebel prisoner whom two of our men were taking to the rear. He belonged to a South Carolina regiment, and in vain I tried to make him talk, but he was disinclined to be agreeable. I soon passed within range of the rebel fire. The shot fell thick about me, and shells were bursting all around. I hardly knew which way to turn. A spent cannonball came rolling over the ground toward me, and I involuntarily put out my foot to stop it, when a soldier drew me back. A bullet whizzed past my ear, so near I felt like it was burning. It occurred to me I'd better change my base." End quote. For all that Edwin Barrett is able to give you the kind of feel for the Battle of Bull Run, he doesn't witness one of the most crucial aspects of the battle, though. He doesn't witness the crucial moment. The key moment of the battle happens at a place called Henry House Hill. There's this spot, and you can still see it today, it's been preserved. There's this spot on this hill where of course, Henry House is. And if you'll recall, Barrett mentioned a feint. There was this artillery that was meant to hold Beauregard's division in its position so that it could be flanked. Well, one of the key moments in the battle is it's this twofold moment when an artillery commander named Edward Porter Alexander realizes that there is a feint and that the real fighting is happening someplace else. Edward Porter Alexander he goes on to become a famous soldier for the Confederacy. He writes about it, and he writes about how he sees this feint happening, and he rushes to Beauregard, and he tells him, oh no, the fighting's not happening here, the fighting's happening someplace else. So Beauregard hops on his horse and goes immediately into the thick of the fighting. Beauregard supposedly has a couple horses shot out from underneath him in the thick of the fighting. But the thick of the fighting happens where Beauregard rushes to meet Union forces on the Henry House Hill. John Keegan writes about this moment, quote, "Beauregard led a counterattack up Henry House Hill, turning back a Federal column, after which the Union retreat became general. Exactly why, nobody could tell. Thousands of soldiers were in motion, milling about this way and that. As many as 12,000 Federals, it was estimated, had lost their regiments. Fewer Confederates had fallen into disarray. That was probably the reason for the Confederate success, unorganized as it was." End quote. Another key moment is when Stonewall Jackson's Virginians sneak up onto a battery, this battery that is pounding Confederate troops at the Henry House Hill. They sneak up to them, and because of what we mentioned earlier about how there's no sort of uniformity in the uniforms, these Federal troops think that the Confederates sneaking up on them are Federal forces. And so they hold their fire, they wait for them to get up to within close range of them, and then the Confederates unleash on them, just tear them apart. It supposedly happens that Stonewall Jackson arranges his men and sort of commands them and keeps them in line. And a General B is trying to do the same thing, and he points to General Jackson and he says, "Look at Jackson, who's held his men up like a stone wall. Be like Jackson, be like the Virginians." Or he also might have said, "Rally behind the Virginians." It's debated. But regardless, Stonewall gets his nickname, and his brigade is called the Stonewall Brigade after his actions around Henry House Hill. But this counterattack by Beauregard, for some reason, and it's hard to know exactly why, it leads to this general retreat by Union forces. And it's probably due to what we've talked about, how there's such poor command at the lower levels. You have probably good top-line command, like Irvin McDowell and his aides and his command apparatus. They're probably competent commanders. The problem is down at the lower levels, at your sergeants, captains, majors, colonels. They are not as well trained and versed in civil warfare yet, so they are struggling. They're struggling to know what to do. They're struggling how to sort of keep their troops organized. They've been drilling them in and around Washington, but they haven't figured out the nuances of this thing. And, like the saying goes, when you get punched in the face, all the plans that you've had kind of go out the window. And when shot and shell start firing around you, it becomes very difficult to maintain order in a battle line. And what is so important about this Civil War era warfare is that you have to stand in line and just sort of give and receive volleys of musketry while artillery is just pounding you on your flanks and in your center. And it's a very difficult thing to do. And these lower level commanders struggle with it. It's probably why Stonewall Jackson is so revered, is he was one of the few commanders who did it effectively, or at least effectively enough that his brigade ends up becoming a central factor in turning the tide of the battle. Another aspect of this is that the Confederates, or the rebels, they unleash the rebel yell in this battle, and it's something that, again, the Federal forces aren't prepared for, aren't used to. They don't know what to do with it, and it terrifies them. A veteran talks about the rebel yell and what it does to you. He says this, quote, "There's nothing like it on this side of the infernal region. The peculiar corkscrew sensation that it sends down your backbone under these circumstances can never be told. You have to feel it." End quote. They do feel it, and they retreat. And it leads to this general mayhem kind of a thing where you have wagons that were not left back in Centreville. They were brought up with the army, and they get bogged down, and it turns into this absolute mess. Warren Goss writes about it, quote, "The drivers on the south side, finding they couldn't cross with their wagons, now began to cut their traces and mount their horses and hurry away. Those who drove baggage wagons on the safe side of Cub Run then began to desert them and cut the traces and shout and gallop off. The infantry, seeing this confusion and not understanding the cause of it, quickened their pace. Soon the narrow road became filled with flying troops, horses, baggage wagons, and carriages. Then the volunteers began to throw away their muskets and equipment so as to stand an even chance in the race. Here and there, all along the route, abandoned wagons had been overturned and were blocking the way. One white-headed citizen, an old man, looking very sorrowful, stood directing the soldiers on their way to Washington, saying, 'You'd better hurry on or the cavalry will cut your retreat.' The houses all along the route were filled with wounded men, while the ambulances were filled with officers hastening to Washington. Soldiers here and there marched in groups and sorrowfully discussed the situation and its causes. The expression heard on every side among them was, 'Why were not the reserves brought up from Centreville to help us? Why don't they bring up the troops from Fairfax Courthouse?' End quote. But to just talk about the Federal retreat, almost cheapens it because the Confederates are doing the exact same thing. It's just maybe less bad, which is, I guess, what's so interesting about it. Edward Porter Alexander writes about it afterwards, and he talks about how Jefferson Davis comes up from Richmond to witness the battle, and he sees so many stragglers from the Confederate lines streaming back to Richmond. He turns to Alexander and says, quote, "Battles are not won where men leave their ranks in such numbers as this," end quote. It turns into this complete mayhem kind of a thing, and along with the Federal Army that's come out to the battle, there's also civilians and congressmen and picnickers and people that are coming to witness the battle because, it's just going to be such a fun thing. I'll confess to you, this idea of picnickers witnessing a battle is one of those inciting moments that caused me to do this podcast at all. In fact, it was that initial kernel. I was sitting down thinking, like, what are some of those moments that just intrigue me and stick to me? It's the idea that picnickers come out to a Civil War battle thinking that it's just going to be this fun jaunt with the boys kind of a thing. We're just going to have a grand old time. It's going to be entertaining. And they get a Civil War battle. They get First Bull Run. And it turns into an absolute stampede of retreat and mayhem, and men are literally throwing their muskets away, trying to get away fast as they can, and wagons are overturned, and congressmen are captured, and their wives are running. It turns into just total chaos. And I wonder what that moment must have been like, and how unbelievable it was, I guess, to the people witnessing the battle. Like, you're coming out expecting to see one thing, and you get something entirely different. You're seeing the horrors of cannon fire and arms torn off. And Alexander writes about a man who was in the process of shooting his musket. He had his arms up to shoot the musket, and a cannonball tore right through his torso. Just tore him apart. And he's writing about how that image just won't leave his mind, and he just stands there fixed on the body, and it's just, you're almost not meant to see something like that. And in my mind's eye, I think about what it would have been like to witness the battle, not just as a soldier, which certainly would have been disconcerting, but also as a civilian, where you have no intentions of witnessing some of the things that you end up witnessing, and how you can't unsee that again. And what does that do to your psyche afterwards? Edward Alexander writes about a moment when a congressman's captured by a Confederate colonel, and he describes the moment like this, quote, "The colonel had drawn his revolver and was trying to shoot the little citizen who was dodging behind the big sergeant major as Cash, the colonel, turned his horse about and tried to get at him, poking at him with a pistol and swearing with a fluency which would have been creditable to a wagon master." Now quoting the colonel, "You infernal son of a bitch, you came to see the fun, didn't you? God damn your dirty soul, I'll show you." And he spurred his horse to get around the sergeant major. Now Alexander says, "What's the matter, Colonel?" said I. "What are you trying to shoot that man for? He's a member of Congress, God damn him," said the colonel. "Come out here to see the fun. Come to see us whipped and killed, God damn him." "But Colonel," I said, "you must not shoot a prisoner. Never shoot an unarmed man." The colonel huffs and puffs and decides, okay, I'm not going to shoot him. And he says, "Turn him over to the provost guard," he said to the sergeant major, "and then go and hunt in the woods for Senator Foster. He's hiding there somewhere. Go find him, and goddamn you, if you bring him in alive, I'll cut your ears off." End quote. The congressman is a Mr. Eli from New York who'd come down to witness the battle, and Alexander writes about how Eli sort of sticks close to him because he saved him from Colonel Cash. And Alexander says that he just sort of cowered and hung behind the line of prisoners as they took him to Richmond, where he was eventually traded or pardoned. Alexander witnesses the general retreat, the breakup of the federal forces, and he writes about it this way, quote, "In fact, the enemy's whole army practically broke up and disorganized during that and poured back over the road to Washington, a mass of fugitives. Even a squadron of cavalry with a gun following along the road and firing an occasional shot would have made it a panic. There's no legitimate excuse for our not following. It is rarely that any army has such a chance as our army then, and it ought to have played it for all it was worth." End quote. There's a lot of questions and Monday morning quarterbacking that happens with something like this, where for whatever reason the federal forces break up, probably due to poor command on the lower levels, but they break up and stream back towards Washington, and then the Confederates never take advantage. And it's one of those things where you don't know exactly why. I think I've read that Stonewall Jackson supposedly wanted to go all the way to Washington and harry them all the way back. Alexander says that they should have, but for whatever reason, they don't. And I'm sure it's out there. I think it was probably a combination of Beauregard and Jefferson Davis that said, no, stay back, get more organized, probably because they weren't much more organized than the federal forces were, but they managed to be just a bit better and were better on the day and therefore took the field. Bull Run is incredibly important, not least because it's the first battle in the war, or maybe the first big set-piece battle in the war, but it's because, as John Keegan puts it, it's the first episode in an entirely new way of warfare. It's a struggle between beliefs fought by populations quite untrained to fight. He continues that its result, while being so ambiguous militarily, served to strengthen the passions on both sides, end quote. It's the kind of battle that just sort of makes you more of what you already were. It's the kind of battle where all of your feelings going into it are further cemented by the actions of the battle because it's not conclusive. And yet it's so interesting because everything could have turned on a dime based on this battle. It could have been extremely conclusive. In fact, if the Confederacy, you could make an argument, if Confederate forces had pursued Federal forces into Washington, maybe they wouldn't have taken Washington, but they could have, capitalized on their victory at Manassas Junction. But instead they stay back and they don't capitalize on the victory and they allow Federal forces to regroup, to breathe. But Confederate forces take solace in the fact that they won, that they took the field, and they sort of take it as an omen for how things are going to be moving forward. James McPherson writes about it, quote, "The experience necessary to fight the Civil War had to be gained in the Civil War itself. As generals and civilian leaders learned from their mistakes, as war aims changed from limited to total war, as political demands and civilian morale fluctuated, military strategy evolved and adjusted." End quote. Public opinion of the war prior to Bull Run in the North had been so universally positive that Bull Run acts as this reality check, I guess. This idea that here's war. What you expected wasn't war. This is war. There was this idea that the North would rout the Confederacy, rout the rebels in 60 days. It was a very popular concept, this idea of a 60 days war. And then in the South, on the flip side, there was a senator who said that, the Civil War, it would only fill a thimbles full of blood. On both sides of it, both North and South thought that this would be a quick thing. They thought that they could just bring their opponents to a decisive battle and it would be over. And opinion in the North and in Washington after Bull Run is that this was a complete disaster, that it was a devastating defeat. And yet, of course, it wasn't exactly devastating, and it was barely a defeat, but it was enough of one that it really brought into, I guess, plain view the issues. The issues being that of command, issues being, training, and it was very obvious that this was not going to be such an easy thing as everybody thought. Famously, the Tribune editor Horace Greeley sent Lincoln a letter where it's an overwrought emotional thing where he's saying like, oh, we're screwed, basically. If you boil it down to what it is at its base level, it's Horace Greeley going, oh shit, this is real. He says something like Lincoln was not a great man, and Horace Greeley, it's depressing. And he is an overwrought emotional kind of a guy, and often you'll read about Horace Greeley that he's an interesting fellow. I think people around him thought that he was a bit of an overwrought guy. So it was no real surprise that his reaction to something this consequential was so overwrought, but still, It reflected a group of people that were completely shocked at the outcome of Bull Run. Yet on the flip side, there was a growing opinion that it couldn't be any worse. Doris Kearns Goodwin writes this, quote, "Yet the harrowing lessons of Bull Run generated a perverse confidence that the North could take comfort in already knowing the worst that could happen. It was unimaginable in the anxious chaos following the first major battle of the Civil War that there was worse yet to come." End quote. If you study history at all, what I'm about to say, will not be surprising to you. In fact, it's probably preached to you from the historian's pulpit over and over again, right? It's that when you're doing history, you almost have to put yourself in a presentist kind of view to where you think with a mindset of somebody who might have been thinking or feeling things at that very moment in time. That is to say, you're thinking in the immediate wake of the Battle of Manassas or of Bull Run. You're thinking the thoughts that those people, or you're writing the sentiments that those people would have been thinking, instead of thinking with a bird's eye view of what the entirety of the Civil War is. You're not thinking about Fredericksburg or Antietam because those things haven't come yet. The people living at the time can't even imagine what the Civil War will become. And so for them, at this very moment, the combined losses of 4,000 dead or 5,000 dead in the Battle of Bull Run, it's catastrophic. It is a severe bloodletting. And so when you're reading some of these sources, you have to make a conscious effort to not think about this battle as, oh, it's just, one step on the road towards what the Civil War eventually becomes. You have to think of it in the terms that people living through the time would have thought of it. And for them, it was supremely catastrophic. I mean, it was, like we said, it will make you more of what you already were. Perhaps Horace Greeley, in that sense, represents the sentiment that, can we even win this war at all? This is from John Meacham's book, And There Will Be Light. He quotes Horace Greeley, quote, "And if they cannot be beaten, if our recent disaster is fatal, do not fear to sacrifice yourself to your country. If the rebels are not to be beaten, if that is your judgment, in view of all the light you can get, then every drop of blood henceforth shed in this quarrel will be wantonly, wickedly shed, and the guilt will rest heavily on the soul of every promoter of the crime." End quote. He asks further in that same letter for an armistice. He says, okay, well, we're not going to win, so what's the point? Lincoln, though, he's got other ideas. He brings in a new general to run things. He brings a scion of the railroad business, a member of an influential Philadelphia family. He brings George Brinton McClellan. At just 34 years of age, he was already known as a disciplinarian. In fact, he would be called Little Mac. He was described as, this New Age's Napoleon for his ability to organize, to drill. His forces were universally regarded as incredibly well-disciplined, which, in the wake of Bull Run, that's an attractive quality, right? He presided over a victory at Philippi, which, calling it a victory is, that's what it was, but it was basically his soldiers arrived and surprised some Confederates who ran, and then it was called the Philippi Races. McClellan, though, did not take part in the Battle of Bull Run. He probably could have, but he didn't. McClellan's interesting. If you read his diary, you're going to come away with an impression, or at least I come away with an impression that, frankly, is not all that positive. I don't like McClellan that much. I'll just put my biases on the table in front of me. McClellan just comes across as a certain type of individual that I would not get along with in real life. He thinks he is God's gift to humanity, which is, it's an interesting quality. And it's probably something that if you are, going through all the qualities that make a really good general, narcissism's probably on the list of one of those qualities that you're going to have. Winfield Scott seems to have a little bit of this, except he had theoretically backed it up with years upon years of expertise and service. but he is an overwrought dramatic character in his own right. McClellan is an overwrought and dramatic character as well. He'll write to his wife as he is brought into Washington this, quote, "President, Cabinet, General Scott, and all deferring to me. By some strange operation of magic, I seem to have become the power of the land." End quote. He saw also that there were things that he could fix, and he also wrote this, quote, "I see already the main causes of our recent failure. I am sure that I can remedy these, and am confident that I can lead these armies of men to victory." End quote. Now, my opinion of McClellan is shaped by what he will end up doing, but at this moment in time, if we're just to place ourselves at this point in the story, not knowing how things will turn out, you would think that McClellan is the saving grace because he is a younger Winfield Scott, a more able organizer, a disciplinarian. He was reputed as taking men that were completely untrained to fight, and he whipped them into shape, and they started to look like a military. They started to look like a functioning army. He will take the forces in and around Washington City, and he will turn them into an army. He will drill them. The hills around Washington, as Shelby Foote says, they will be dotted white with tents, and the firing ranges will be crackling with musketry. He's going to send military police into the bars and pull men out who have left their regiments, and he's going to force men to present a pass if they want to leave their regiment for any reason at all. He turns these civilian forces, this rabble, this mob, into an army. And soon, also as Shelby Foote says, the forces in and around Washington will outnumber the citizens of Washington itself. It is a powerful display in the wake of the disaster at Bull Run. But McClellan has to make a decision. He has to decide what this, now that he's trained this army, now that he's sort of whipped it into shape in the weeks afterwards, he's got to figure out what to do next. And the issue, at least the one that will become an issue that will rear its head from this moment onward, is this butting of heads between McClellan and Winfield Scott. You got to remember, Winfield Scott is, in his mind, God's gift to humanity, and McClellan is, in his mind, God's gift to humanity. And as Meemaw used to say, there can only be one God's gift to humanity. There can't be two. When you have narcissistic butting of heads in a strategy meeting, well, I mean, one side has to eventually win out, and it becomes very difficult to get a uniformity of vision when McClellan has an idea, Scott has an idea, and Abraham Lincoln, who's trying his best, is trying to mediate between the two and figure out the best combination of, political, binding politics to military strategy. He's trying to figure out the best way to blend those two things together. About 10 days after taking over the Army of the Potomac, McClellan will write in his diary that he has achieved his object. This is now a functioning military force. They're trained and drilled. They look good on parade, but now he's got to figure out what to do with them. Alan Pinkerton, his head of intelligence, who smuggled Lincoln through Baltimore before his inauguration, was a known detective and collector of information. A very colorful fellow. If you look at photos of him, he looks like an interesting guy. Maybe the 1861 version of the most interesting man in the world, Alan Pinkerton. He's just got that look to him. Pinkerton, through his spy network, informs McClellan that there's at least 100,000 well-drilled Confederate troops in and around the Potomac, to the point that McClellan will write that there are 150,000 Confederate troops, well-drilled, entrenched, encamped in and around the Potomac River. And because of this number, McClellan is frozen in place. He can't figure out what to do. This becomes a theme of McClellan, probably some of my dislike for him that extends beyond his personal feelings about things, but maybe it's partly due to the fact that he appears so good at drill. But when it comes time to actually put that drill into action, McClellan stalls. And you almost have to give him the benefit of the doubt in the moment because his head of intelligence is telling him that he's heavily outnumbered and he doesn't want to go into, another decisive battle and bring about a second bull run that is, catastrophic. McClellan wants to fix the problem, but he's not quite sure what to do with this new force that he has drilled and put together, and so he waits. Truth is, there's 45,000 Confederate troops in and around Manassas Junction. And it makes you wonder, how is it possible that Alan Pinkerton reports to McClellan that there's near 150,000? How do you overestimate by more than 100,000 troops? Regardless, they do. They overestimate. And so while McClellan is sitting in and around the Potomac River with his 100,000 troops, or 120,000 troops, he's thinking to himself that the Confederates have 150 when they've only got 45. I love how James McPherson writes about McClellan. You can read into how historians think about people based on the, descriptors that they use to describe them. He pulls a Ulysses S. Grant quote, where in his memoirs, Grant says about McClellan, quote, "McClellan is to me one of the mysteries of the war," end quote. So use that as one building block for McPherson's view of McClellan. And then McPherson writes this about McClellan. This is while he's considering what to do while he thinks there's 150,000 Confederates in Manassas. McPherson says this, quote, "A curious lack of confidence began to creep into McClellan's words and deeds, even as he continued to think of himself as God's chosen instrument to save the Republic," end quote. A quick side note here, I just love it when you get like a sarcastic historian remark filtered through the, perspective of writing the history. You just get like a little flavor, perhaps, of what the historian actually thinks. My parents used to tell me growing up, if I were to say something really snarky, they'd be like, "Tell me how you really think." Little quotes like that from a historian where they say, at least in this example, where McPherson says that McClellan thinks of himself as God's gift to the universe. I just love that. I love the honesty that's kind of guised, by the writing. It's not so obvious if you know and read about McClellan because it's pretty accurate, but it's just really funny that a historian will be like, "Yeah, that guy, I love it." Anyways, while McClellan is waffling about the size of Confederate forces in and around Manassas, he waits, does nothing. But while he waits in Virginia, things are happening beyond in and around Washington City. Things are happening in Kentucky and Missouri, and the war is starting to take on a new color, I guess, as bright political feeling turns into military action, and you get other rising suns beyond just McClellan. Something I've been thinking about while I've been working on this show and researching and all the things is you think about all the individuals that kind of come out of the woodwork and end up becoming important members of this war. Everybody knows about Ulysses S. Grant, right? We all know that he was, the failed businessman, couldn't do anything meaningful prior to the war. He was a failure in many ways, in a lot of the ways that society measures success prior to the outbreak of the Civil War. Ulysses S. Grant is a failure. William Tecumseh Sherman, in a similar vein, is not nearly as successful. His name is made through his actions in the war. And when you have an important event like a civil war, something that many people would argue is the most important event in the United States history, you're going to have people like that just sort of appear out of the woodwork and become incredibly important figures in not only this war, but in American politics. And they shape what America is in drastic ways. There's also individuals that come out of the woodwork and become very important for a short period of time and end up making their way into the history books, but, don't necessarily become president, like a Ulysses S. Grant or something like that. Or maybe they don't have the lasting endurance of a Stonewall Jackson or a General Robert E. Lee. But you do get these individuals that kind of pop out of nowhere, and you almost wonder, like, is it it lends itself to a classic historical debate. It lends itself to the debate of, great man theory, the great man theory of history, or just the trends and forces theory. The great man theory says that the actions of the man dictate the times, or, your Eurocentric people are going to say that Winston Churchill dominated European politics and was so important in World War II just because he was Winston Churchill. Never mind the fact that the war had to happen for, him to be needed, which is where the trends and forces people would say, yeah, Winston Churchill would never be Winston Churchill if World War II hadn't come along. And World War II is not solely caused by Winston Churchill, so therefore it can't solely be Winston Churchill's fault that he inevitably becomes as important in world history as he becomes. There's this push and pull between these two theories. It's one of those things where it can't be all one way or all the other. There has to be a little bit of the two. Alexander the Great can't become Alexander the Great unless he's got his father's Maserati of a military just waiting for him, with the keys in the ignition. Julius Caesar can't necessarily grasp his place in the world pantheon without certain conditions in the Roman Republic being the way that they were set up so that he could grasp at his place in the world pantheon. There's a little bit of, in world history, there's a little bit of the men or the women or the individuals rise up at a certain period in time because they possess certain characteristics, but also the conditions of the world around them allow them, to make their entrance onto the world stage. It's a very interesting kind of discussion. And I've been thinking about it a lot because there's a guy named Nathaniel Lyon that pops out of nowhere in Missouri at the outset of the Civil War. And this is so clearly, reading the source material, it's so clearly a guy that probably would be a Winston Churchill kind of a character. He would be a Ulysses Grant kind of a character. He is one of those individuals where you go, that is a powerful figure. He's got fiery red hair, flaming blue eyes, if you can imagine that. Seeing a picture of him, and it's tough to find pictures of Nathaniel Lyon, but they're out there, and he's got these piercing blue eyes, if you can imagine that, flaming red hair. So if you can find a colored image of him, it's probably better for it, because I keep finding these black and white images, and I know it's just not quite doing him justice. Flaming hair, piercing eyes, and he's short and stocky, but he's got this personality that is clearly, it belongs in somebody who's 6'6". But Nathaniel Lyon's probably only like 5'7". Lyon is the federal commander of the St. Louis Arsenal in Missouri, and he is sort of the federal representative in the state of Missouri. And it's a very kind of touchy situation, especially when you're looking at this from a constitutional perspective. Because Missouri, if you'll recall, has been in sort of this fits and starts civil war. It's gone from a cold to a hot to a cold civil war within its own borders. I mean, it's a microcosm of everything happening in the Union, writ large, but it's happening in Missouri by itself. You've got Unionists and pro-slavery, pro-Confederate forces, and it's not even forces like that. Almost that gives you this connotation that it's organized armies. I mean, this is mobs and this is back alley stabbings. I mean, there's a Mrs. Hill who writes about her husband who leaves their house and takes a shortcut to go to the train, and two pro-Confederates find out that he's a Union man, and they sort of wait for him as he goes in this alley to cut to the train, and they chase him and shoot at him. I mean, that's sort of the flavor that you're getting in St. Louis. St. Louis is also heavily populated by German immigrants. In fact, about a third of the population of St. Louis are German immigrants. And I really like the context that the Lakeside Press edition of Mrs. Hill's journal gives to the presence of all these German immigrants, because it sort of lays things out pretty simply. So we'll just quote this. This is from the Mrs. Hill's journal Lakeside Press edition, quote, "About a third of the population of St. Louis consisted of German immigrants who came to Missouri in the 1840s and 1850s. They left Europe after the collapse of the Democratic Revolution in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and in the various German states. Since many of them fought against these despotic regimes in the Spring of Nations revolutions of 1848 and 1849, they were strongly opposed to slavery and considered the Southern states oppressive and autocratic. End quote. As often happens with immigrant populations, they sort of unite under a single leader or a couple of leaders. In this case, the German immigrants unite under men named Karl Schurz and Franz Siegel. The U.S. arsenal in St. Louis also happens to be in, I guess, this German quarter of St. Louis. And so one of the things that Nathaniel Lyon does pretty early on is he allies himself with Schurz and Siegel. And you got to think about it too. Nathaniel Lyon arrives on the ground, or he's been there, and he's looking around at the landscape going, okay, who are my allies? You know, surveying the battlefield as any warrior would. He says, okay, well, the Germans are clearly and obviously going to be my allies in this. And as a bonus, the Germans have been drilling their own militia of sorts because Franz Siegel has seen the writing on the wall, knows civil war's on the way, and he wants to be prepared in the eventuality that there's some kind of fighting. So there's this semi-trained German force of troops in St. Louis that Nathaniel Lyon is not able to command, but he's able to ally himself with these two men and sort of create this kind of coalition of militia forces and federal forces. But he's got to be careful because as the federal representative, you got to remember that, you know, states' rights are a big talking point of this whole thing. And if Nathaniel Lyon sort of supersedes state representatives, you know, he's not the president, but he's like an acting representative of the president. If he supersedes the state government and does so in a way that's kind of despotic or tyrannical, he's getting into slippery ground. But at the same time, you have, you know, rebellion breaking out across the United States, and Nathaniel Lyon's a man of action. It's a very kind of touchy situation that probably a more tactful individual, a more politically minded individual, would have done things slightly differently than Nathaniel Lyon does. But Nathaniel Lyon, as we've mentioned, is a man of action. And so, of course, he takes action. The governor of Missouri was a man named Claiborne Jackson, and he was a pro-slavery, pro-secessionist believer from the start. As soon as Lincoln sends out his call for troops from Washington, Claiborne Jackson then sends a message immediately to Jefferson Davis asking for Confederate troops so that Missouri can be secured as a state in the Confederacy. But of course, this immediately pits Claiborne Jackson and Nathaniel Lyon against each other as almost polar opposites of one another butting heads. So Claiborne Jackson establishes a militia of like 700, 800 men, and he camps them at a place called Camp Jackson. And in one of these bizarre sort of footnote moments in the Civil War, Nathaniel Lyon goes and surveils Camp Jackson disguised as a woman. It is a very, like, imagine this sort of a thing. You have a federal brigadier general who, instead of sending men to sort of surveil the heights, he says, no, I'm actually going to dress up as a woman, hop in a carriage and just go ride through Camp Jackson, and then we'll decide what to do from there. It almost sounds too good to be true, but the sources tell me this actually happened, so it creates even a better picture of what Nathaniel Lyon is. He dresses up as a woman, surveils Camp Jackson, and decides that they're going to raid Camp Jackson along with a couple regiments of these German Americans and some of his own forces from the arsenal. So his forces do surround Camp Jackson and capture the camp without firing a single shot. They capture the entire camp, take all the weapons away, and then parade through St. Louis. The problem is when they're parading through St. Louis, a crowd gathers, and in a very similar fashion to the Baltimore riots, this crowd in St. Louis begins to riot as well. Because while there are pro-unionist sympathies in Missouri, in St. Louis, there's also obviously pro-slavery sympathies in Missouri. And so this turns into a massive riot. We're told 28 people are killed, 2 soldiers are killed, and it creates this utter panic in St. Louis. You have German Americans hunting down pro-slavery Americans and killing them in the streets, and vice versa. You have pro-slavery Americans hunting down Germans and Dutch and killing them in the streets. It's utter panic, total chaos. And so the moderates, even though these are not moderates, but Lyon and Frank Blair and Claiborne Jackson, they decide to hold a conference. On June 11th, they hold a conference in St. Louis to sort of mediate these issues and come to some kind of an agreement. The problem is they can't come to any sort of an agreement, and Nathaniel Lyon reportedly storms out of the meeting and he says, quote, "Rather than concede to the state of Missouri for one single instant the right to dictate to my government in any matter, I would see you and every man, woman, and child in the state dead and buried. This means war." End quote. Just sort of imagine the kind of man we're talking about here, because I would imagine the stories that we have of Nathaniel Lyon are a bit, there's probably some hagiography going on. I mean, how many individuals deliver lines like that with such apparent gusto, also dress up as women to surveil enemy entrenchments? I mean, this is an individual that you probably need to take what's written about them with a grain of salt. I'm superimposing, and maybe everything happened exactly the way it's written, but it's one of those things where, going back and reading some of these sources, they will impose lines of dialogue, or they'll say that such and such person said this, but really they didn't say it. What they did instead was they demonstrated a sentiment, which then the writer later on, maybe a year or two later, when they're writing the book, they will say, oh, they actually said this. That quote from Nathaniel Lyon is from a book published in 1886. And so you wonder, did Nathaniel Lyon actually say that as he's storming out of the courthouse or storming out of the meeting place? Probably not. But the sentiment that he would have delivered is there. Would Nathaniel Lyon have said, for all history and all time, I'm going to kill every man, woman, and child so long as we can keep Missouri in the Union? I doubt it. But again, I'm not a historian. I can say these things. I can say, I don't know, but it's there in the books, and you take it for whatever it's worth. Nathaniel Lyon, with the help of his German-American and Dutch-American troops, immediately occupies Jefferson City, Missouri, and he helps establish a new, what they call it, a long convention. And this is a very interesting sort of a thing. The Governor Jackson, decamps and sets up a new legislature near the Arkansas border. And nominally they are in charge of Missouri, but Nathaniel Lyon almost sets up this convention that elects a new government, essentially. This convention says that because Nathaniel Lyon drives off Governor Jackson and the actual legislature, that the legislature is vacant. So then they have the license, I suppose, to elect a new government. And this long convention will de facto rule Missouri until January 1865, until after the war a new government is elected in the more traditional manner. Now, Lyon camps his troops near Springfield, Missouri, and the Confederates aren't going to take all this lying down, obviously. They send forces led by Ben McCulloch and Sterling Price, who link up together and start moving towards Springfield, Missouri. There's this idea, and this concept in the West of a decisive battle. There's this idea that on both sides, if the Confederates can defeat the Federals, if the Federals can defeat the Confederates, there's going to be this decisive change in the fortunes for Missouri, so that whoever wins will then control Missouri. Nathaniel Lyon seeks out combat then with the Confederates led by Price and McCulloch. They meet at this little creek called Wilson's Creek. Franz Sigel leads a column of German Americans, while Nathaniel Lyon leads another column of Federals, and they move to meet the Confederates near this creek, and this central point of conflict becomes this hill called Bloody Hill. The Confederates initially take this hill, and the Federal forces drive them off the hill, and it becomes this point of contention where the Federals hold the hill, and then the Confederates are attacking, counterattacking, trying to take the hill, and they're struggling. But in the process of fighting, as E.B. Long says in the Civil War Day by Day, quote, Lyon allowed Brigadier General Franz Sigel to try and strike the Confederate rear, an unwise effort that failed miserably. Sigel, being dispersed, withdrew precipitately and was heard of no more that day." End quote. The problem for Lyon is he is outnumbered massively. The Confederates have about 11,000 men in this fight, and Nathaniel Lyon starts off with 5,400, but nearly half of those are driven off when Franz Sigel is routed. And so Nathaniel Lyon probably should withdraw here. He's got this point of contention on Bloody Hill, and they're being slowly pushed back. They're starting to run out of ammunition. But Nathaniel Lyon, remember, he's the guy who says, "I won't rest until we kill every man, woman, and child so that we can make Missouri a member of the Union." Nathaniel Lyon is a blowhard one, but he backs it up. I mean, he thoroughly believes all the things that he says. He's leading resurgent attacks one after the other. He gets hit in the leg, and he sort of withdraws back a little bit to get it wrapped up, and then he returns back to the front, and he's exhorting his men. He says, carry on, we're going to take the day, and then he's hit in the chest, and Nathaniel Lyon is killed. When Lyon falls, the Union forces disperse almost immediately, and the Battle of Wilson's Creek is a resounding Confederate victory. But despite what people may have thought beforehand, it was in no way conclusive, because Major General John Charles Fremont takes control of Missouri in the wake of the battle. He fills that gap that Nathaniel Lyon leaves with his death. And Fremont immediately institutes martial law. He suppresses local newspapers. And then, to the chagrin of the Lincoln administration in Washington, he also declares that all slaves captured are immediately free. Now, why would the Lincoln administration have issues with this? Well, for one, because this war is not a war about slavery yet. I say yet very intentionally because that's what it will become. But for the moment, the war is a war to keep the Union together, especially in these early months when the war aims of both of these sides are incredibly important, not only for, getting soldiers into uniform and getting them out in the field. You have to define very clearly what you're fighting for. But even further, you have to define what you're fighting for an international audience. You also have to, there's a little bit of a posterity thing here. The Lincoln administration doesn't feel like they have the authority to go into states where slavery exists and say, oh, actually, all these slaves are no longer your slaves. Constitutionally, the Lincoln administration isn't supposed to be able to go into places and say, we're going to take your property because we want to. That's dictatorial, despotic. It's all the things that the Founding Fathers wrote against. And yet we are in a time of war. And in a time of war, in situations like this, there is much more leeway for making proclamations like this. But the war early on, we haven't even gotten a full year into it. We are a couple months in, and Fremont announces that slaves will be made free. Abraham Lincoln supposedly commented on this act and called it dictatorial. Fremont is another one of these individuals that gets a role in this Civil War story, and it's just, there's so many individuals that end up becoming important members of the Civil War story, and it just seems like they don't fit. Fremont makes his name as an explorer of the American West. He is like an 1850s version of Lewis and Clark. Except if Lewis and Clark were almost like freebooters or conquistadors in the name of the American government. And of course, maybe they were that to some extent. Of course, the story that comes down through history about the Lewis and Clark expedition is not necessarily one of freebooting and, plunder taking and some of these things that you'll associate with Spanish conquistadors. John Fremont is more of that conquistador kind of character. And he's appointed as a major general at the beginning of the war. Why? Because he's famous and capable and has explored the West. He's based in Missouri, and he's the next logical candidate after Nathaniel Lyon is killed at Wilson's Creek to take over the federal effort in Missouri. But the way he does so is so, dictatorial that Lincoln is concerned Fremont will alienate the pro-Union side of Missouri. Missouri is split. In fact, the resident government of Missouri that's been driven out by Nathaniel Lyon, they will declare for the Confederacy. So Missouri is split pretty much half and half between a pro-unionist section and a pro-slavery, pro-Confederacy section. And Abraham Lincoln is concerned that with this declaration by Fremont, you're going to have some constitutionalists that are going to say, hey, wait, you can't actually do that. And they're going to decide for the Confederacy on the basis of, well, the federal government's taking away all of our property. They're acting despotic. They're acting against the wishes of the founding fathers. So Lincoln recalls Fremont, strips him of command, and actually countermands the order, says, well, no, we're not going to take away slaves. It's so interesting how Lincoln handles all these different border states because they all require different treatment. Maryland gets the hardliner attitude where Lincoln rounds up dissenters and political adversaries and he throws them in jail. He sends Benjamin Butler to basically occupy Baltimore, and he sort of clamps down on resistance from Maryland because Maryland is also right in their backyard. So you got to handle that, in one sense. And then he's very tender with Kentucky because Kentucky is a little bit of it's a tinderbox situation. He also feels like he can be tender with Kentucky and actually get something done. Missouri, it's a little bit of both. He's got to be, tender in one sense, but also a hardliner in another. And he just sort of navigates this, and it works. It works out, at least in the sense that there is a pro-unionist section in Missouri that is substantial enough that it remains, at least nominally, a member of the Union, whereas you've got this almost defector group that declares for the Confederacy. But the fact that Lincoln dismissed Fremont at all is fascinating, and I think it tells you quite a lot about what Abraham Lincoln was as a man. We talked in the last show about how he often would separate what he felt the role of the president was versus his own thoughts and feelings. And while his thoughts and feelings seemed to be, and again, you're sort of reading between the lines with Lincoln a little bit here because he is a politician. I think a lot of times when we talk about Lincoln, we just sort of forget that he's a politician. And politicians, since the beginning of the whole American experiment, they've all been politicians. There's always a, playing to the base or playing to a constituency and sort of navigating these slippery situations. But often in reading letters that Lincoln will write, he will say things that would lead you to believe he has nothing but bad things to say about slavery as an institution. But then there's this separation between how he feels about slavery and how he actually treats it as a president, as a leader. Abolitionists, when they hear that Fremont has banned slavery in Missouri, they're celebrating. In fact, William Seward's wife will write to her friends like, oh, aren't you so excited about this proclamation that Fremont just announced? And Frederick Douglass is so excited about the fact that, we're actually getting some tangible steps towards the removal and abolition of slavery in the United States. It's like once you have this precedent that somebody has done it once, we can do it again, and we can do it in a more permanent way. But Abraham Lincoln, he countermands the order. He says, no, we're going to operate under the Confiscation Act, which is if you sort of look at it from a bird's eye view, you might say, well, what's the difference between the Confiscation Act, which says that the government can sort of recruit slaves or take them away from the Confederacy, and by taking them away, on the one hand, you deprive your enemy of their use, but also you can then use them to your own advantage to whatever you needed, the former slaves to do, you can then have them do for you. But one thing the Confiscation Act does not provide is the abolition of those slaves. So those slaves, you can take them away from the Confederacy, but you're not freeing them. You're just employing them for your own uses. Benjamin Butler, he's sort of the primogenitor of this idea. He's in North Carolina, and slaves are escaping from their southern masters, and they come to where Benjamin Butler's encamped, and they say, how can I help? And Benjamin Butler's going, wait a second. If I, under the fugitive slave laws, if those laws still remain, I'm then required to return these slaves to their masters, but we're at war with their masters, so I'm not going to return the slaves to their masters. In fact, I'm going to try and employ them to help around the camp. So he'll send letters back to Washington where he says, I need some sort of backup here, because technically this is illegal if we're operating under the Fugitive Slave Act. The government says, well, you're at war. We're fighting an insurrection, and therefore we can confiscate property. In this case, property extends to human slaves, and we can then use them to further our own war aims. It sounds pretty terrible now with the modern mind, right? We look back on it and we go, ooh, that doesn't sound good. It's not exactly a human rights benefit, but also at the same time, in the long view of things, it is sort of a human rights benefit. But, it's a very difficult thing to sort of have to reckon with, because the great emancipator, as he'll come to be known, the first time you get a true emancipation furtherance, I guess, with Fremont in Missouri, he says, no, we're going to operate on the Confiscation Act, which means we can take slaves from their masters as they are the property of the masters, which we are now fighting a war against, but we're not going to free them. Abraham Lincoln, in a letter to Fremont, outlines the reasons why he does this. Again, it's all political. It's all in the aims of satisfying a political agenda. He writes to Fremont, quote, "First, should you shoot a man according to the proclamation," he's talking about shooting a Confederate or a man who owns a slave, according to Fremont's proclamation. He says, "Should you shoot a man according to the proclamation, the Confederates would very certainly shoot our best men in their hands in retaliation, and so, man for man, indefinitely." He continues, quote, "He saw great danger in liberating slaves of traitors' owners, a move that would certainly alarm our Southern Union friends and turn them against us, perhaps ruin our rather fair prospects for Kentucky. Allow me therefore to ask that you will, as of your own motion, modify that paragraph so as to conform to the recent Confiscation Act of Congress." End quote. Doris Kearns Goodwin, in her book Team of Rivals, outlines the underlying subtext here as to why Abraham Lincoln wanted Fremont to countermand the order himself, to go back on his word a little bit. Goodwin writes this, quote, "Lincoln was anxious that Fremont should change the language of his own accord so that the president would not be officially forced to override him. He understood that if the controversy became public, radical Republicans whose loyalty was crucial to his governing coalition might side with Fremont rather than with him." End quote. Even still, abolitionists like Frederick Douglass looked upon the order as a massive failure, a massive missed opportunity to capitalize and maybe turn what Fremont had done into something that could advance the furtherance of the abolition of slavery. He wrote in his diary, quote, "Many blunders have been committed by the government at Washington during this war, but this, we think, is the largest of them all." End quote. The situation in Missouri had gotten very dicey. Rebels were attacking Union men, as the paper said. The rebels were attacking Union men left, right, and center. There was no order in St. Louis. It was nearly ablaze. Partisans on both sides of this issue were at each other's throats, and Fremont was failing to keep the peace. He was failing to suppress rebel sentiments in St. Louis and around St. Louis, and he had also failed to sort of stamp out rebel sentiments and rebel forces where they were. Fremont knew this. He was trying to find rebel forces and take them out, but he couldn't. So Lincoln, when he released the news that Fremont had been relieved of duty, what he did, and this is, again, you got to remember, he's a politician. This is one of those moments when you got to give Lincoln a small golf clap, because he releases word through the papers about what is happening in Missouri. He's releasing word that Fremont is unable to keep the peace. He doesn't talk about the slavery part of it rather at all. He talks instead about how Fremont is basically failing at his job, and there's concern from Frank Blair, who is Fremont's right-hand man, also the brother of cabinet member Montgomery Blair, who Fremont had arrested and put in jail because Frank Blair wrote a letter to Montgomery, his brother, saying, "We're basically at fault for getting Fremont appointed, and we should figure out a way to basically take his command from him. Fremont got the letter and said that Blair had sort of violated a code of conduct or something. It was conduct unbecoming of a gentleman, and he had him imprisoned. So in one fell swoop here, the politician, the slippery politician that he is, Abraham Lincoln is able to push the ball further down the road about dealing with slavery. He says, we're not going to deal with it right now. He also gets public support for dismissing Fremont even after Fremont has said, let's actually emancipate the slaves, something that is a very popular sentiment in the North. And Lincoln is able to dismiss him and countermand the order and do so in a way that the public is excited about. The public believes that Fremont cannot be allowed to maintain his post, and they all get behind Lincoln. But Lincoln realizes and knows that something has to happen on the war front for the cause, this fervor that is generated in the North to continue. McClellan has not made any major moves. He's sort of stalling. And it's the Confederacy, it's Jefferson Davis that actually forces Lincoln's hand into some sort of action. Jefferson Davis appoints 2 commissioners, well, 3 actually, but a commissioner to Britain in James Mason and a commissioner to France in James Slidell. This is important for a lot of different reasons, but chiefly because the South, and Jefferson Davis especially, realizes after First Bull Run that if they're going to succeed, they're not going to necessarily just succeed on the battlefield. They need to succeed in foreign courts or in the court of foreign public opinion. You see, Abraham Lincoln had declared a blockade. And on its face, it seems like not a very big deal that Lincoln would have declared a blockade. But it's important for a couple different reasons. One, Abraham Lincoln declares a blockade when they're not really prepared to actually enforce a blockade. It's an element of that Anaconda plan that Winfield Scott is so fond of, that you constrict the Confederacy, you cut off that arteries of supply from Europe, and in so doing, you can smother them, theoretically. But there's also a political element to this. If you can maintain a blockade, if you're the North, it is in a way showing that you are self-sufficient, that you are dominant, that you are sort of maintaining your role as, the supreme government of the land. If you can't maintain a blockade in international law anyway, it's almost as though you are unable to sort of maintain your own sovereignty. And so the Confederacy needs to slip the blockade. They need to prove that the blockade is actually not as effective as the government would have everybody believe. Jefferson Davis talked about the blockade by saying, quote, "The so-called blockade was a monstrous pretension," end quote. Another Southerner, Frank Owsley, wrote that the blockade was, quote, "an absurdity, scarcely a respectable paper blockade, and it was old Abe's practical joke on the world," end quote. So on the one hand, you have to maintain a blockade in order to prove your sovereignty in the court of international law. The other thing here is the U.S. federal government never declares war on the Confederacy. They declare it rather an insurrection that they're putting down. They're putting down a rebellion. This is important too in the court of international law because international law allows for different rights for belligerent powers at sea in a time of war. So let's say you are a ship maintaining a blockade for the Union. The laws that extend in international law to what you can do to a Confederate ship are very different if you've actually not declared war. If you haven't declared war and you sack a ship, let's say, in the Confederacy, it's sort of a touchy subject. Like, is that even legal in international law to sack your own shipping? Or let's say, perhaps, that the British had sided with the Confederacy. Let's say the French had sided with the Confederacy, and there were Confederate soldiers on board a French ship, per se. In international law, the United States is not actually allowed to really do anything to those soldiers on a French ship because they're not at war with one another. They're not belligerents. And so because Lincoln never actually declares war on the Confederacy, it gets a little touchy with this international law thing. And so if a Confederate ship slips the blockade and then is taking cotton or tobacco or whatever, sugar perhaps, they're taking that to international markets and then selling it at international markets, it gets really touchy about what U.S. ships can actually do to Confederate shipping. Theoretically, once Confederate shipping slips the blockade, I mean, you're not going to chase them necessarily, but it creates these sort of interesting situations, these technicalities in international law that can make Lincoln's life complicated. Even still, the blockade, while, the Confederacy is claiming that it's a paper blockade, it's not even effective at all. There's the political element to this, but there's also a very practical element. There's still ships slipping the blockade. But as James McPherson writes, just because ships are slipping the blockade doesn't mean the blockade isn't effective. He writes in Battle Cry of Freedom, quote, "The 500,000 bales shipped through the blockade during the last 3 years of war compared rather poorly with the 10 million exported in the last 3 antebellum years. As far as the greater dollar volume of Charleston's wartime trade is concerned, there were 2 reasons for this. Charleston was one of the principal ports for blockade runners because they were shut out of the other ports, and inflation so eroded the Confederate dollar that by March 1863, it required 10 such dollars to buy what one had bought 2 years earlier." End quote. So let's look at this as you're a planter. You own a plantation in, Georgia, for example. You've got to, once you actually do the farming, you do the collecting of product. The product is cotton in this sense. You then need to sell your product at international ports or in an international market or something like this in order to recoup value. And while you're in war, obviously your Confederate dollar is going to be greatly eroded because, one, it's very difficult to actually export your product and then sell it in international markets. And of course, when you're in war, naturally currency becomes inflated. But let's say you are just trying to get in some of your, quality of life imports, like coffee, for example, or sugar, or whatever it is, salt, pepper. You're going to be very hard-pressed to actually bring those things to your home because of the blockade. Now you're not getting those international imports necessarily, or at least it's much more difficult to get them, and they're fewer and farther between because of the blockade. So in a broad sense, the blockade is both not extremely effective and extremely effective because it's affecting everybody's quality of life, and it's also making it more difficult on the Confederacy to export and import goods. But at the same time, it's not wholly effective because you still have ships slipping the blockade here and there, and it makes life difficult for everybody in an international law sense, and it also makes it difficult for people to bring in some of their quality of life imports. It's in this situation that Jefferson Davis dispatches 3 commissioners to foreign embassies. Much of this episode with the commissioners sent to England and France, especially to London, there is this gamble that the Confederacy will take that is based in an ideology or a mode of thinking called cotton is king. It is rooted in a speech that James Henry Hammond gave in the Senate, which essentially said that, the South took pride in the fact that they exported cotton and that cotton was king, that it was so important in international markets that the South would always be buoyed by cotton. He said this in his Cotton is King speech, quote, "What would happen if no cotton was furnished for 3 years? I will not stop to depict what everyone can imagine, but this is certain. England would topple headlong and carry the whole civilized world with her, save the South. No, you dare not make war on cotton. No power on earth dares to make war upon it. Cotton is king." End quote. There's going to be this bet made by the Confederacy that cotton still holds sway in foreign governments, that they depend upon it so heavily that they will, be persuaded by the Confederacy to come on the side of the Confederacy in this Civil War. And early on, this is one of the chief aims, I suppose. Obviously, you have your immediate war aims, but in an international sense, Jefferson Davis and company, they need somebody to come in on their side. There is this acknowledged deficit in terms of production material and population and things like this that certainly the war can be won without, an England or a France in a strategic sense. It can, but it's going to be difficult. If the South has a real fighting chance here, one of the easiest and best ways you can bolster your efforts is to have an England or a France to come in on your side. And let's not forget, part of the reason why America exists at all is because the French came in on the side of the Americans against the British and sort of forced this continental war in Europe that, dragged several different countries into it and basically made it incredibly difficult for Britain to focus on just suppressing the fledgling colonists. So Jefferson Davis dispatches Mason and Slidell. They slip the blockade and they go down to Havana, Cuba. While they're in Havana, they're going to parties and rubbing elbows with all sorts of individuals. And also in Havana, Cuba is a ship captain in the United States Navy named Charles Wilkes. Wilkes had been suppressing the slave trade in West Africa and had come back to the United States, or at least to the Caribbean, and he overheard or caught wind of these Confederate commissioners that were en route to England and to France. Charles Wilkes decides in that moment that he can impact the war effort in a major way just by dealing with these commissioners. So he goes back out to sea and ascertains, which ship these commissioners are going to embark upon, and he traces the route that the ship will take, and he lies in wait. He goes out into the Caribbean and waits for the ship. These commissioners board the mail packet Trent, a British ship, and then on November 8th, Charles Wilkes intercepts the Trent and captures the commissioners. He takes them up to Fort Warren in Boston, and the initial reaction from the entire United States is one of exultation. It's like we scored a hit on you kind of a thing. It's like a jab in a boxing match where it's not a knockout punch, but it certainly will score some points, at least maybe in the court of international opinion or in a judge's mind. It's the kind of thing where, everybody knows the Confederacy can just send more commissioners, but to be able to capture these commissioners and symbolically say, well, they were just going to advocate slavery. They were going to advocate this insurrection. The fact that we captured them is sort of significant of the fact that the federal government is supreme. But this joy is short-lived. 3 weeks later, the now commissionerless mail packet Trent arrives in Southampton in England, and the word spreads like a wildfire that the federal government has captured these two men from a British mail ship, forcibly taken them from the ship, and then sent the ship along its merry way. Instantly, we have a crisis. Why do we have a crisis? What does it matter if the federal government takes these Confederates off the ship? Well, we talked about this right of belligerence earlier. This idea that if you have two countries at war with one another, the one country, if they see Confederate commissioners on a neutral vessel, they can just remove them and, send the vessel on its way. But because the U.S. is not technically, in an international law sense, at war with the Confederacy, there's really no reason to be capturing persons aboard a neutral vessel and then sending the vessel on its way. In fact, as international lawyers would assert, the proper mode of operations would have been to, if you're going to capture these commissioners, immediately send the ship and the persons to an international judge to adjudicate this, situation, and then let the international judge render a verdict to which all the parties involved would adhere. Instead, Charles Wilkes captures the two men, sends them up to a prison in Boston at Fort Warren, and, goes about celebrating his small victory here. The papers in London are immediately crying war. Imagine for a moment that nuclear war doesn't exist. This is a difficult thing to put your mind into now because, it's difficult to place yourself in a time that you already know how everything turned out. But imagine for a second that this concept is not a thing. It doesn't affect geopolitics or the American way of life or anything like that. If you happen to live in Springfield, Illinois, or Boston, Massachusetts, or Washington, D.C., or wherever, and you catch word that the English are supremely pissed off because an upstart captain captured 2 Confederate commissioners off of one of their ships, this would be the equivalent of a, Cuban Missile Crisis standoff. This is a rattling of sabers moment between England and the United States, and everybody knows that a war with England is catastrophic. If England comes in on the side of the Confederacy or separately declares war on the United States, to put it simply, the United States is screwed. This is a situation that is code red, can't happen, possibly the very worst situation for the war effort, because then you're going to have to do some sort of a naval war, and you've got to split this war between multiple theaters. Very bad. So when these papers make their way back across the ocean and they find themselves being read in New York and Boston and other places, you get this effect that's probably very similar to what would have happened if the Soviet Union was rattling their saber and saying, we're going to launch a nuke if you don't do this. In my mind, it's probably not a good equivalent, but it is on that same level of panic and fear. Charles F. Adams, the diplomat, the grandson of John Quincy Adams, great-grandson of John Adams, would write later on in 1912 about this tense moment, because the Trent Affair by itself, this capture of these Confederate commissioners, by itself, it is a potentially terrifying experience for Americans, for the American government and the war effort. But if you take it along with everything else that's happened, it is, it's not a straw that broke the camel's back moment, but it is one of those sort of series of events where if you're a regular person going about your life trying to just escape all the noise and all the papers and all the doom and gloom that you're hearing every day at work and every day when you interact with other people in your life, it's one of those things that's just like, oh no, we now got to deal with England. We have another thing to deal with beyond just this great civil war that's breaking out. You're still worried about, is the war going to last maybe another month? Is it going to last 3 months, a year? How many people are going to die in this whole thing? And obviously they can't know. They have no clue, how this is all going to turn out. And so you're, as Charles F. Adams will put it, you're on tenterhooks. You're on edge constantly. And the Trent Affair is like the nail in the coffin for the regular person who's living on edge. Charles F. Adams writes this, quote, "Speaking generally, I think I do not remember in the whole course of the half-century's retrospect, equal to the period which elapsed between the surrender at Yorktown and the presidency of Andrew Jackson, any occurrence in which the American people were so completely swept off their feet, for the moment losing possession of their senses, as during the weeks which immediately followed the seizure of Mason and Slidell. Everything combined to this result. In the first place, when the incident occurred, the community was in a wholly overwrought nervous condition. On the 8th of November, 1861, 7 months had elapsed since the firing on Fort Sumter and nearly 4 months since the mortifying Bull Run experience. It was exactly a year from the election to the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. That election, it will be remembered, had been immediately followed by the initial movement of South Carolina in the direction of secession. Then, following the trying winter of 1860 and 61, during which state after state seceded, the war cloud in the South ever gathering and assuming day by day a more threatening aspect, the 5 months which elapsed between this election of 1860 and the firing on Fort Sumter were probably the most trying period psychologically this country has ever passed through. The inevitable was constantly assuming a more portentous shape. At last, in April, war broke out. Thus, in November 1861, the country had been on tenterhooks, so to speak, for 12 entire months, and during the last 6 of those months, one mortification and failure had followed sharp on another." End quote. But there's an even more practical reason for all of this, beyond just the potential doom and gloom of an international war. You have a very real concern by the federal government, by Lincoln administration, about their ability to actually prosecute the war if England decides that they're going to be belligerent. If you have a war with England, that's one problem. The other thing is you can't import English exports. And there are some English exports that are incredibly important for the federal government in prosecuting the war. And so you have this question of, okay, how can we put the genie back in the bottle? Because as James McPherson puts it, there's a chief issue for the federal government beyond just the prospect of international war. He writes, quote, in 1861, British India was the Union's source of saltpeter, the principal ingredient of gunpowder. The war had drawn down saltpeter stockpiles to the danger point. In the fall of 1861, Seward had sent a member of the DuPont Company to England on a secret mission to buy all available supplies of saltpeter there and on the way from India. The agent did so and was loading 5 ships with 2,300 tons of the mineral when news of the Trent reached London. The government clamped an embargo on all shipments to the United States until the crisis was resolved. No settlement, no saltpeter. End quote. The broad question then becomes, did Charles Wilkes, the captain, that captured the commissioners, did he act under government orders or was he going lone wolf? Was he going rogue? And while initially his actions are celebrated, that has to go back in the bottle as well. So William Seward then immediately writes to England and he says, oh no, there was no orders from Washington. He just went on his own. There's no governmental authority given to Wilkes to do what he did. Therefore, the American government can't be held at fault. And meanwhile, papers in London are saying it must be war, it must be war. In fact, you'll even read things like, if it were two, and this is to quote the papers, if there were 2 Negroes, the actions of the London government would be the same. In essence, saying that the breach of international law was so egregious that it didn't even matter that it was Confederates, it didn't matter if they were slaves, that England would stand upon business. There's this growing fear, too, that, if England is going to stand their ground on something like this, which is really, if we're being technical here, it's a technicality. If you have the right of a belligerent, you can do some of these things, but you don't have the right of the belligerent, so you can't do this stuff. It's one of those things where if England wanted war, this could be the pretext for it. And so the question arises in the United States, does England want war? It's the measuring stick, the litmus test for international feeling about the Civil War. So when the Queen orders British troops to move in Canada, it's this growing tension where if you're Charles F. Adams writing about the regular folks, you hear, oh great, British troops are being marshaled in Canada, we've now got a British problem. The sky's falling, it's nuclear war, we have the war with the Soviet Union, it's that same kind of a thing. We're going to be invaded from the north, we got to deal with the Confederates in the south and the British in the north, and we're screwed. Ultimately, the Lincoln cabinet will meet and they will argue and deliberate about what they should do with these commissioners that they've captured. By the end of December 1861, they decide, okay, we're just going to send the commissioners to England. We're going to let them carry on their way and we'll see what happens. As soon as they deliver the commissioners to England, everything dissipates. It was all a bluff. And everybody realizes, okay, we can breathe easy. But what's most important about this situation is that litmus test. It's, okay, what do these foreign governments really think about the Confederacy? If they had, an inkling that they were going to need to go to war or join the Confederacy in any way, if the Confederacy was worth joining, foreign countries would have done it here. And you do get this issue where France, Napoleon III is like, well, maybe we should make things a little difficult for the United States and Mexico, but by and large, everything settles. And you get this peace, I guess, this lasting answer to that question that had been theoretical before the capture of Mason and Slidell. We don't do ads on the show. However, I did record a bonus episode of the podcast exclusively for those who support the podcast on Substack or Patreon. You know how I was talking about the Trent affair? Well, I did a bonus episode about 40 minutes long, give or take, where we get into it a bit more deeply. The Trent Affair it's a moment that I find super fascinating, and I went and dug up a bunch of primary sources about it because I wanted to know more. It seemed like it was one of those things where you go, oh, this is a near miss that nearly caused a giant catastrophic event. I mean, what happens if England comes into the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy? What changes then? So in the bonus episode, we look at some primary sources and some of the legal arguments that weigh heavily in on the Trent Affair and why it becomes an international incident. If you want to check that out, consider supporting the podcast on Patreon or Substack. I'll have links to those in the description below. There's this peculiar thing that happens in the wake of the First Battle of Bull Run. George McClellan, he comes in, he's this Napoleonic kind of a figure. He reorganizes the army and sort of puts his stamp on things. And then the government is sort of waiting for the next thing. Abraham Lincoln especially, he's like, okay, do we take initiative? And what does that initiative look like in terms of this broader conflict? What do we do next? Now that we've had our first setback and we've sort of recouped and we're ready to do the next thing. What is the next thing? And he's leaning on McClellan to give him that next thing. The problem is McClellan comes down with typhoid fever. George McClellan's on his deathbed for about 5 months. And for this 5-month period, this is a, disaster case kind of a scenario, a code red, as it were. And you feel like you're about ready to come up and, counter the uppercut that you've been hit with. It's almost like you take your first string boxer out. If we can mix up some sports analogies here, you take your first string boxer out, and let's say you have a backup just sitting, in the corner. You pull the second string boxer out and you go, here you go. But the twist is this second string boxer's never boxed before. What do you think happens next? Well, if they were to actually fight, the second string boxer would get his teeth kicked in. But Abraham Lincoln is your second string boxer. He has never commanded troops before. He hardly doesn't even know that departments exist in the government. He broadly knows how a government works, but everything he learns is learned on the job. So when he gets into the White House and occupies the president's office, he's got to learn how do departments work and how do department heads work and what do they do? What's their day-to-day and how do I guide and sort of play the levers of government? He doesn't know how any of that stuff works. He figures it out pretty quickly because he's a quick study, but he doesn't fully know how any of this stuff works. And when George McClellan comes down with fever, he is everything. Everybody's pinning all their hopes on George McClellan. He comes down with fever and he's incapacitated. First of all, you have this period where he doesn't do anything. You get these reports coming in that there's troops in their hundreds of thousands out in Virginia. He doesn't really know what to do. He doesn't do anything, catches the fever, and then it all kind of grinds to a halt. Abraham Lincoln, your second string boxer, steps in and has to sort of man the war effort. He has to act like a general-in-chief. He's got to assume those commander-in-chief powers. But Abraham Lincoln is not a general. He's read manuals. He stays up late at night reading manuals by candlelight. But he's never been to West Point. What do you do if you're Abraham Lincoln and you're put in command of an army in the most consequential moment in your life, and probably also the most consequential moment in the lives of everybody around you? And you're thrust into a moment where you don't know what you're supposed to do, and yet you have to take charge anyway. Both armies go into winter quarters, almost staring across at each other. Not exactly, but, broadly speaking, they're pretty much able to throw a rock at the other force. They know they're there. They just have to figure out, okay, what's the strategy going to be? What are we going to do? They go into these hibernations. And so your second string boxer doesn't actually have to throw a punch, but what if he does? And there's this fear in Washington that maybe the Confederates are going to attack. Maybe they're going to get word that McClellan is incapacitated and they're going to take a gamble. What happens if they come knocking and the only guy able to man the reins of generalship is a guy from Springfield, Illinois, a lawyer. What happens then? I love how in this transition from 1861 to 1862, I love how E.B. Long puts it in his almanac about the Civil War Day by Day. He writes this about the turn of the year, quote, "In the White House at Washington, a worried Mr. Lincoln virtually had to take command of the armies, for his top general was seriously ill. Besides, George Brinton McClellan, it appeared, had accomplished little of substance in 5 months. In the White House at Richmond, an equally worried Mr. Davis watched his armies diminish in manpower, as many went home to fix things up so they could come back in the spring. The blockade was more than paper now, its impress growing with the days. There was not enough of anything, really, except valor." End quote. James McPherson has a heading in his book, Battle Cry of Freedom, a chapter heading where he says that the period after the Battle of First Bull Run, the Battle of Manassas, that period, he calls it the death of the 90 Days War. Because you obviously had all of these prognosticators coming in saying, oh, this will be a quick thing. We'll just, have a big one decisive Western conventional battle, and then this thing will be decided once and for all. Of course, that doesn't happen. And so there's obviously this 5, 6, 7 month lull where not much happens at all, but you do have a few things that sort of pop up here and there. Benjamin Butler has a naval victory in North Carolina that is nominally important. It sort of takes the sting out of, Wilson's Creek and Bull Run a little bit for the North. There's this battle at a place called Ball's Bluff, where the Union side suffers about 900 casualties, but there's only 1,700 total troops engaged. It's a total disaster. McClellan doesn't do a whole lot, but right before he comes down with fever, he does order Charles Stone to go and find Nathan Evans's soldiers at this place called Ball's Bluff in October 1861. And there's this skirmish, and then Union soldiers sort of retreat, and then they drown crossing the river trying to escape, kind of a thing. By the way, if you want to see a face to haunt your nightmares, go look up a picture of Nathan Evans, Confederate Brigadier General in this Battle of Ball's Bluff. This guy is terrifying. I mean, he looks, I'm not even exaggerating all that much when I say that he looks like what you would imagine Dracula would look like if you sort of shaved the beard off. He's got those hollowed eyes, and they're piercing. They're obviously blue or green, perhaps. Piercing bright eyes, but obviously these photographs of him are black and white and really grainy. So if you would have just imagined somebody that could be Dracula if you took his beard off, he just has that same kind of Transylvania Dracula kind of a look. It's horrifying. And obviously his soldiers destroy Union troops at Ball's Bluff to the point that, everybody's looking for a culprit, right? Everybody's trying to figure out, why is this 90 Days War that we thought we had coming in, why is that not coming to fruition? Why hasn't this thing been wrapped up? Why are we struggling so hard? And two, you got to think about it from the sense of, in war, oftentimes there's this tendency by opponents, by belligerents, to kind of dehumanize their enemies. Famously, the Mongols, when they're invading China and the Khwarezmian Shah's empire, they will famously say that, they're invading these lazy, sedentary, settled societies, and that the Mongol way is the most pure way of living, this nomadic lifestyle, this warrior lifestyle, that their lifestyle is clearly better and more civilized than the settled societies, because the settled societies are lazy and fat and all these things. Well, the Union, the Federals, they think the Confederates are just kind of a rabble. They are confident in their industry that they'll be able to take them down rather quickly. Right? We can manufacture just about anything we need. They're going to struggle to keep up with us. We have hundreds of thousands of soldiers ready to go in the field, and they look so pretty, and their muskets are so shiny, and their tents are all, perfectly white, and their uniforms are pressed and beautiful, and McClellan has them drilled to perfection. And why are we struggling? What's going on here? And you have these moments where it is so clear that, as McPherson will say, that the skills necessary to win the Civil War have to be learned in the war. Oftentimes, when you're talking about advances made in military technology, there's the advances that can be made before a war, but oftentimes you have the advances made during a war. As needs must, you have to create technology or skills or things like that to sort of meet the needs that the war, illustrates. And there's this almost a military tribunal of senators, not generals, but it's a group of senators that get together to relitigate what happened with Ball's Bluff, because you need a scapegoat. You need to figure out, okay, why are we unable to put to bed this Confederacy problem that we're clearly better prepared to handle than, as evidenced by, results in the field? Why can't we take them out? This group of senators gets together. They form essentially a military tribunal to relitigate what happened at Ball's Bluff. Part of this is it stems out of frustrations with McClellan's inaction. It stems from, the papers say if we just go take battle to Beauregard near the Manassas Junction, we could defeat him. You have some reports that they contradict what McClellan is saying he's up against. The president is restless, trying to see something happen. This is all in October, right? We are a couple months removed from First Manassas, and there's this tribunal that for the remainder of 1861 is almost relitigating all of the failures that have happened up until that point. It's an initial push by the House of Representatives to have an oversight committee for the conduct of the war. Congress will follow in lockstep as well. So then you have this House of Representatives and the Senate now relitigating failures happening in the war. You have this tribunal that is the, did you do your job well sort of a tribunal for the remainder of the war. It is, as one source that I read put it, it is the most egregious example of congressional oversight into military matters in United States history. Their first target is the commander who presided over the failure at Ball's Bluff, Charles Stone. In a paper titled Congressional Oversight Run Amok, James T. Curry writes this, quote, "The committee's modus operandi was simple and subject to abuse. It invited members of General Stone's command to appear before it in a closed session and offer their opinions as to the character, fitness, and actions of their commander. While this method had the advantage of promoting candor, it also allowed the introduction of hearsay, error, and vindictive testimony. Because the witnesses were promised confidentiality until their testimony was published much later as a committee report, this procedure prevented Stone from knowing exactly what witnesses were saying about him." End quote. As a result, when Stone is answering questions about Ball's Bluff, he doesn't exactly know what sort of motives the question askers have, because he has no idea the general questions about his conduct. He doesn't know, okay, they think I didn't do this well or they think I didn't do that well. He's going in totally blind. And so his testimony about his actions is all over the place. It is not focused. And therefore, the Congressional Oversight Committee then thinks that Charles Stone, he's a target from day one. They almost have their minds made up because you have these jealous lieutenants and captains who look at the Ball's Bluff fiasco and say, well, if I was in charge, I would have done better. Doesn't help Charles Stone's case that a couple months before he had had a verbal spat with Senator Charles Sumner because Charles Stone rebuked this notion that you should go and free slaves. Charles Sumner was an outspoken abolitionist, one of the mouthpieces, I suppose, for the abolitionist movement. And Charles Stone got headlines because he basically said, hey, we shouldn't go free slaves. Keep in mind, this is the Lincoln administration's, technical approach to all of this. He's not doing anything out of the norm, but because you have a lot of different wings in the Republican Party, namely, an abolitionist wing and a more moderate wing, the leader, one of the mouthpieces of the abolitionist wing, then comes at Charles Stone, and then Charles Stone writes a vicious letter in retaliation, comes short almost of challenging Charles Sumner to a duel. So you have this background where he's nearly come to blows with other members of Congress. And so Congress looks at this Ball's Bluff thing and says, well, he was the guy in charge of it. He might actually be a Southern sympathizer if you look hard enough. So, yeah, he's guilty. This oversight committee orders that General McClellan arrest Charles Stone, which he does 10 days later. He dawdles for a while, and then he does it. Charles Stone immediately requests basically a court-martial so that he can actually be charged with something. That request is denied. This legal battle runs all the way up the flagpole to Lincoln himself. Abraham Lincoln writes this in response, quote, "Under my general authority and upon evidence, which, whether he be guilty or innocent, required, as it appears to me, such proceedings to be had against him for the public safety," end quote. Lincoln assured Congress that Stone would be charged and would be tried, as is his right as a United States citizen. But this entire thing is a fabricated kind of a deal, and it's because everybody is looking for a whipping boy. You have a General McClellan who's ineffective. You have a president who is on very shaky footing with the public, and he's trying to balance these two wings of the Republican Party. And you're going to have, and this is the thing with Lincoln, he is such an interesting figure because early on in the war, every chance he has to do what you would expect him to do based on our notion of Lincoln, right? He doesn't do it. He has the opportunity early on to declare slavery as the great evil of the war. He doesn't do it. Suspending the writ of habeas corpus for individuals that are surely suspected of being Confederate sympathizers. In fact, they're speaking out against the government. There's the potential for violence on the rail lines. You know, that's one thing. But then you have a general, a commanding officer that is arrested on charges of, frankly, hearsay. And Lincoln says, well, there's reasons. What are the reasons? Well, the committee that Congress put together, the committee came up with valid reasons that, he needed some oversight. He failed so spectacularly. You see how this is such a weird, interesting moment where you get multiple sides of Lincoln. And you might be thinking, well, this whole series, I guess, has just turned into an examination of Lincoln the man. And in some ways it is. Because again, when we started this podcast, we said that this was an attempt to examine the 2D versions of the historical figures that you know. And Lincoln, the more you read, he becomes incredibly three-dimensional, but he's got rough edges. He's a slippery political character. It doesn't just come out in arguments about slavery. It comes out in some more basic things. Hey, maybe if your general loses, it doesn't mean that he's a traitor. Maybe he's just an incompetent general because nobody knows how to fight the Civil War yet. When George McClellan doesn't, pursue the enemy, perhaps it's personal cowardice. Hey, maybe we shouldn't have promoted him in the first place. You learn these lessons as the war goes on, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to be arresting commanding officers because they lost a skirmish. The Ball's Bluff fiasco and the Congressional Oversight Committee, though, the downstream effects of those things are pretty far and wide. It's one more fiasco in a series of fiascos. 1861, if you look at it in totality, it's a year of fiascos. It's a year of collective panic. If you're somebody who lives in the North, you think, oh, this is one thing after another. If you're somebody who lives in the South, you think, okay, when's something going to happen? It's like that meme where the person is poking, somebody laying down on the ground with a stick and they're going, do something. The Confederacy kind of feels that way because they can't take advantage of the Union's inability to press their own advantage. You have two sides that feel like they have advantages and neither one of them can really capitalize on them because they don't know how to fight a war yet. The generals that you recognize from the Civil War, they haven't even come into center stage yet. Robert E. Lee is like fifth on the line of succession, if you will, of Confederacy's generals. He's not the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia yet. He's just a guy who was recently promoted from colonel. Ulysses S. Grant is in the Western Theater. He doesn't even come into the forefront until February or March of 1862. At this point, Abraham Lincoln hardly even knows Ulysses S. Grant exists. You got all those, patriotic young men that sign up to fight the war at the very beginning, thinking that it'll be a quick thing, thinking that if I don't strike while the iron's hot, perhaps I'm going to miss my chance. And you got to wonder how all those young men are feeling after the first 6, 7, 8 months of the war, when the war has sort of turned into something different than you thought it would be, and yet it still has more evolutions to go. These 3-month volunteers are going to turn into years-long volunteers. In some cases, they'll be reconscripted back in. I wonder if those young men, if they could peep through the keyhole perhaps at what the future would hold for them, would they still sign up? Or would they say, nope, I'm good, not worth it? E.B. Long says that at the end of 1861 and going into 1862, both sides of this conflict didn't really know how to fight the conflict yet. They didn't have anything except verve. They didn't have anything except passion. How long does that passion last when the bodies start piling up? When battles that claim the lives of only several hundred turns into thousands? What happens when a war that's supposed to be wrapped up in 90 days morphs into something entirely different? What happens when that war becomes total war? Earlier on in the show, I mentioned that there was a bonus episode for those who support the show on Substack or on Patreon. I'll have links to that in the show notes below, but just a quick little reminder, if you want to get an extra look at the Trent Affair, maybe a deeper dive into some of the international law, some of the implications of that Trent Affair, go check that out. You'll also get to listen to all these shows early, and if you subscribe on Substack, you'll get my ramblings and thoughts and historical whatever else's a couple times a week. I post some history book recommendations on there as well. All that's usually free. And if you want, you can just listen to the podcast on Substack. Links to that in the show notes below, as well as the bibliography for the show so far. I like to give you a decent enough sense where all this stuff is coming from. What are the sources? What are the things I've quoted? There's a lot down there, so go check out the bibliography. And if you want to research a little bit more on all of this, that bibliography should be a really nice jumping off point for you. Again, thank you so much to each of you listening, telling a friend about Compendium. It really does mean the world to me. I am a really lucky podcaster in that I feel like there's a community gathering around this thing, and I hope that's not a selfish thing to say, but it really does mean a lot to me. These shows are very close to my heart, and I spend a lot of time on them. As you can tell, you've been waiting for a couple months now. I think I looked the other day, and part 1 dropped end of July, and this one's coming out in October. So you've waited a while, and for your patience, thank you so very much. It is incredibly special to me. As I mentioned there at the end, the Civil War still hasn't morphed into what we all recognize as the Civil War. That comes later. That comes in The Sound of Distant Guns, Part 3.